A Killer in Kailash by Satyajit Roy. Chapter 1. It was the middle of June. I had just finished my school final exams and was waiting for the results to come out. Feluda and I were supposed to have gone to a film today, but 10 minutes before we were to leave, it began raining so heavily that we had to drop the idea. I was now sitting in our living room, immersed in a Tintin comic, Tintin in Tibet. Feluda and I were both very fond of these comics, which had mystery, adventure, and humour, all in full measure. I already had 3 of these. This one was new. I had promised to pass it on to Feluda when I finished with it. Feluda was stretched out on the divan, reading a book called Chariots of the Gods. He had nearly finished it. After a while, he shut the book, placed it on his chest, and lay still, staring at the whirring ceiling fan. Then he said, "Do you know how many stone blocks there are in the Pyramid of Giza? 200,000. Why was he suddenly interested in pyramids? He went on. Each block weighs nearly 15 tons. From what is known of ancient engineering, the Egyptians could not have polished to perfection and placed together more than 10 blocks every day. Besides, the stone it's made of had to be brought from the other side of the Nile. A rough calculation shows that it must have taken them at least 600 years to build that one single pyramid." "Is that what your book says?" "Yes, but that isn't all. This book mentions many other wonders that cannot be explained by archaeologists and historians. Take our own country, for instance. There is an iron pillar at the Qutb Minar in Delhi. It is 2,000 years old, but it hasn't rusted. No one knows why. Have you heard of Easter Island? It's a small island in the South Pacific Ocean. There are huge rocks facing the sea, on which human faces were carved thousands of years ago. These rocks were dragged from the middle of an island, taken to its edge, and arranged in such a way that they were visible from the sea. Each weighs almost 50 tons. Who did this? How did the ancient tribal people get hold of adequate technology to do this? They didn't have things like lorries, tractors, cranes, or bulldozers." Feluda stopped, then sat up and lit a charminar. The book had clearly stirred him in a big way. "In Peru," he went on, "there is an area which has geometric patterns drawn on the ground. Everyone knows about these patterns. They are visible from the air, but no one can tell when and how they came to be there. It is such a big mystery that scientists do not often talk about it." "Has the author of your book talked about it?" "Oh, yes, and he has come up with a very interesting theory. According to him, creatures from a different planet came to Earth more than 25,000 years ago. Their technological expertise was much higher than man's. They shared their knowledge with humans and built structures like the pyramids, which, one must admit, modern man has not been able to match despite all his technical know-how. It is only a theory, mind you, and of course it need not necessarily be true. But it makes you think, doesn't it? The weapons described in our Mahabharata bear resemblances to atomic weapons. So maybe the Battle of Kurukshetra was fought by creatures from another planet?" Feluda opened his mouth to reply, but was interrupted. Someone had braved the rain and arrived at our door, pressing the bell 3 times in a row. I ran and opened it. Uncle Sidhu rushed in, together with sprays of water. Then he shook his umbrella and shut it, sending more droplets flying everywhere. Uncle Sidhu was not really a relation. He and my father used to be neighbors many years ago. Since my father treated him like an elder brother, we called him uncle. "What a miserable day! Get me a cup of tea, quick, the best you've got," he said in one breath. I ran back inside, woke Srinath, and told him to make 3 cups of tea. When I returned to the living room, Uncle Sidhu was seated on a sofa, frowning darkly and staring at a porcelain ashtray. "Why didn't you take a rickshaw? In this weather, really, you shouldn't have," Feluda began. "People get murdered every day. Do you know there is a different type of murder that's much worse?" Uncle Sidhu asked, as if Feluda hadn't spoken at all. We remained silent, knowing that he was going to answer his own question. "I think most people would agree that our present downfall notwithstanding, we have a past of which every Indian can be justly proud," Uncle Sidhu went on. "And today, what do we see of this glorious past? Isn't it our art, chiefly paintings and sculptures? Tell me, Felu, isn't that right?" "Of course," Feluda nodded. "The best examples of these, particularly sculptures, are to be found on the walls of old temples, right?" "Right." Uncle Sidhu appeared to know about most things in life, but his knowledge of art was probably the deepest, for 2 out of his 3 bookcases were full of books on Indian art. But what was all this about murder? He stopped for a minute to light a cheroot. Then he coughed twice, filling the whole room with smoke, and continued. "Several rulers in the past destroyed many of our temples. Kalapahar alone was responsible for the destruction of dozens of temples in Bengal. You knew that, didn't you? But did you know that a new Kalapahar has emerged today? I mean, now, in 1973? Are you talking of people stealing statues from temples to sell them abroad?" Feluda asked. "Exactly!" Uncle Sidhu almost shouted in excitement. "Can you imagine what a huge crime it is? And it's not even done in the name of religion. It's just plain commerce. Our own art, our own heritage is making its way to wealthy Americans, but it's being done so cleverly that it's impossible to catch anyone. Do you know what I saw today? The head of a Yakshi from the Rajarani temple in Bhubaneswar. It was with an American tourist in the Grand Hotel." "You don't say?" "I had been to Bhubaneswar when I was a child. My father had shown me the Rajarani temple. It was made of terracotta, and its walls were covered by beautiful statues and carvings." Uncle Sidhu continued with his story. "I had a few old Rajput paintings which I had bought in Varanasi in 1934. I took those to Nagarmal to sell. I have known him for years. He has a shop in the Grand Hotel Arcade. Just as I was placing my paintings on the counter, this American arrived. It seemed he had bought a few things from Nagarmal before. In his hand was something wrapped in a newspaper. It seemed heavy. Then he unwrapped it, and... oh God! My heart jumped into my mouth. It was the head of a Yakshi, made of red stone. I had seen it before, more than once, but I had seen the whole body. Now the head had been severed. Nagarmal didn't know where it had come from, but could tell that it was genuine, not a fake. The American said he had paid $2,000 for it. If you added 2 more zeros after it, I said to myself, even then you couldn't say it was the right value. Anyway, that man went up to his room. I was so amazed that I didn't even ask him who had sold it to him. I rushed back home and consulted a few of my books just to make sure. Now I'm absolutely positive it was from a statue on the wall of Rajarani. I don't know how it was done. Possibly by bribing the chowkidar at night. Anything is possible these days. I've written to the Bhubaneswar Archaeological Department and sent it by express delivery. But what good is that going to do? The damage is already done. Srinath came in with the tea. Uncle Sidhu picked up a cup, took a sip, and said, "This has to be stopped, Felu. I am now too old to do anything myself, but you are an investigator. It is your job to find criminals. What could be worse than destroying and disfiguring our ancient art? Tell me. Shouldn't these criminals be caught? I could, of course, write to newspapers and try to attract the attention of the police. But do you know what the problem is? Not everyone understands the true value of art. I mean, an old statue on a temple wall isn't the same as gold or diamonds, is it? You cannot put a market price on it." Feluda was quiet all this while. Now he said, "Did you manage to learn the name of that American?" "Yes, I did speak to him very briefly. He gave me his card. Here it is." Uncle Sidhu took out a small white card from his pocket and gave it to Feluda. "Saul Silverstein," it said. His address was printed below his name. "A Jew," Uncle Sidhu remarked. "Most undoubtedly very wealthy. The watch he was wearing was probably worth $1,000. I'd never seen such an expensive watch before." "Did he tell you how long he's going to stay here?" "He's going to Kathmandu tomorrow morning, but if you ring him now, you might get him." Feluda got up and began dialing. The telephone number of the Grand Hotel was one of the many important numbers he had memorized. The receptionist said Mr. Silverstein was not in his room. No one knew when he might be back. Feluda replaced the receiver, looking disappointed. "If we could even get a description of the man who sold that statue to him, we might do something about it." "I know. That's what I should have asked him," Uncle Sidhu sighed. "But I simply couldn't think straight. He was looking at my paintings. He said he was interested in tantric art, so if I had anything to sell, I should contact him. Then he gave me that card. But I honestly don't see how you will proceed in this matter." "Well, let's just wait and see. The press may report the theft. After all, Rajarani is a very famous temple in Bhubaneswar." Uncle Sidhu finished his tea and rose. "This has been going on for years," he said, collecting his umbrella. "So far, the target seems to have been smaller and lesser-known temples. But now, whoever is involved has become much bolder. Perhaps a group of reckless and very powerful people are behind this. Felu, if you can do something about it, the entire nation is going to appreciate it. I'm positive about that." Uncle Sidhu left. Feluda then spent all day trying to get hold of Saul Silverstein, but he did not return to his room. At 11 p.m., Feluda gave up. "If what Uncle Sidhu said is true," he said, frowning, "whoever is responsible is a criminal of the first order. What is most frustrating is that there's no way I can track him down. No way at all." A way opened the very next day, in such a totally unexpected manner that even now my head reels when I think about it. Chapter 2. What happened was a terrible accident. But before I speak about it, there is something else I must mention. There was a small report in the newspaper the next day which confirmed Uncle Sidhu's suspicions. The headless Yakshi. The head from the statue of a Yakshi has been stolen from the wall of the Rajarani temple in Bhubaneswar. This temple serves as one of the best examples of old Indian architecture. The chowkidar of the temple is said to be missing. The Archaeological Department of Orissa has asked for a police investigation. I read the report aloud and asked, would that mean the chowkidar is the thief? Feluda finished squeezing out toothpaste from a tube of 4 hands and placed it carefully on his toothbrush. Then he said, no, I don't think stealing the head was just the chowkidar's idea. A poor man like him would not have the nerve. Someone else is responsible. Someone big enough and strong enough to think he's never going to be caught. Presumably, he or they simply paid the chowkidar to get him out of the way for a few days. Uncle Sidhu must have seen the report too. He would probably turn up at our house again to tell us proudly that he was right. He did arrive, but not before 10:30. Today being Thursday, our area had been hit by its regular power cut since 9 o'clock. Feluda and I were sitting in our living room, staring occasionally at the overcast sky, when someone knocked loudly at the door. Uncle Sidhu rushed in a minute later, demanding a cup of tea once more. Feluda began talking of the headless Yakshi, but was told to shut up. That's stale news, young man, Uncle Sidhu barked. Did you hear the last news bulletin? No, I'm afraid not. Our radio is not working. Today is... I know. It's Thursday, and you've got a long power cut. That is why, Felu, I keep asking you to buy a transistor. Anyway, I came as soon as I heard. You'll never believe this. That flight to Kathmandu crashed, not far from Calcutta. It took off at 7:30, but crashed only 15 minutes later. There was a storm, so perhaps it was trying to come back. There were 58 passengers. All of them died, including Saul Silverstein. Yes, his name was mentioned on the radio. For a few moments, neither of us could speak. Then Feluda said, where did it crash? Did they mention the place? Yes, near a village called Siddiqpur, on the way to Hasnabad. Felu, I had been praying very hard for that statue not to leave the country. Who knew my prayer would be answered through such a terrible tragedy? Feluda glanced at his watch. Was he thinking of going to Siddiqpur? Uncle Sidhu looked at him sharply. I know what you're thinking. There must have been an explosion, and everything the plane contained must have been scattered over miles. Suppose, among the belongings of the passengers, there is... Feluda decided in 2 minutes that he would take a taxi and go to Siddiqpur to look for the head of the Yakshi. The crash had occurred 3 hours ago. It would take us an hour and a half to get there. By this time, the police and the fire brigade would have got there and started their investigation. No one could tell whether we would succeed in our mission, but we could not miss this chance to retrieve what was lost. Those paintings I sold to Nagarmal fetched me a tidy little sum, Uncle Sidhu told Feluda. I would like to give you some of it. After all, you are going to get involved only because of me, aren't you? No, Feluda replied firmly. It is true that you gave me all the details, but believe me, I wouldn't have taken any action if I didn't feel strongly about it myself. I've thought a great deal about this, and, like you, I have come to the conclusion that those who think they can sell our ancient heritage to fill their own pockets should be caught and punished severely. Bravo! Uncle Sidhu beamed. Please remember one thing, Felu. Even if you don't need any money, you may need information on art and sculpture. I can always help you with that. Yes, I know. Thank you. We decided that if we could find what we were looking for, we would take it straight to the office of the Archaeological Survey of India. The thief might still be at large, but at least the stolen object would go back to the authorities. We quickly got ready and got into a yellow taxi. It was 10:55 when we set off. "I've no idea how long this is going to take," Feluda said. "We can stop for lunch at a dhaba on Jessore Road on our way back." This pleased me to no end. The food in dhabas, which were usually frequented by lorry drivers, was always delicious. Roti, dal, meat curry. My mouth began to water. Feluda could eat anything anywhere. I tried to follow his example. There was a shower as soon as we left the main city and reached VIP Road. But the sun came out as we got close to Barasat. Hasnabad was 40 miles from Calcutta. "If the road wasn't wet and slippery, I could have got there in an hour," said our driver. "There's been a plane crash there, sir. Did you know? I heard about it on the radio." On being told that that was where we were going, he became very excited. "Why, sir? Was any of your relatives in that plane?" he asked. No. Feluda could hardly tell him the whole story, but his curiosity was aroused and he went on asking questions. "I believe everything has been reduced to ashes. What will you get to see, anyway?" "I don't know." "Are you a reporter?" I write stories." "Oh, I see. You'll get all the details and then use it in a story. Very good, very good." We had left Barasat behind us. Now we had to stop every now and then to ask people if they knew where Siddiqpur was. Finally, a group of young men standing near a cycle repair shop gave us the right directions. 2 miles from here, you will see an unpaved road on your left," said one of them. "This road will take you to Siddiqpur. It's only a mile from there." From the way he spoke, it seemed obvious that he and his friends had already given the same directions to many others. The unpaved road turned out to be a little more than a dirt track. It was muddy after the recent rain and bore several sets of tire marks. Thank goodness it was only June. A month later, this road would become impossible to drive through. 3 other ambassadors passed us. Several people were going on foot, and some others were returning from the site of the crash. A number of people were gathered under a banyan tree. 3 cars and a jeep were parked near it. Our taxi pulled up behind these. There was no sign of the crash anywhere, but it became clear that we couldn't drive any further. To our right was an open area, full of large trees. Beyond these, in the distance, a few small houses could be seen. "Yes, that's Siddiqpur," one of the men told us. "There is a little wood where the village ends. That's where the plane crashed." By this time, our driver had introduced himself to us. His name was Balaram Ghosh. He locked his car and came with us. As it turned out, the wood wasn't large. There were more banana trees than anything else. Only half a dozen mango and jackfruit trees stood amongst them. Each of them was badly charred. There were virtually no leaves left on their branches, and some of the branches looked as if they had been deliberately chopped off. The whole area was now teeming with men in uniform, and some others who were probably from the airline. There was a very strong, pungent smell, which made me cover my face with a handkerchief. The ground was littered with endless pieces of broken, burnt, and half-burnt objects, some damaged beyond recognition, others more or less usable. Feluda clicked his tongue in annoyance and said, "If only we could have got here an hour ago." The main site had been cordoned off. There was no way we could get any closer. So we started walking round the cordon. Some of the policemen were picking up objects from the ground and inspecting them. A portion of a stethoscope, a briefcase, a flask, a small mirror that glinted brightly in the sun. The site was on our right. We were slowly moving in that direction, when suddenly Feluda saw something on a mango tree on our left and stopped. A little boy was sitting on a low branch, clutching a half-burnt leather shoe. He must have found it among the debris. Feluda glanced up and asked, "You found a lot of things, didn't you?" The boy did not reply, but stared solemnly at Feluda. "What's the matter? Can't you speak?" Feluda asked again. Still he got no reply. "Hopeless!" he exclaimed and walked on, away from the debris and towards the village. Balram Ghosh became curious once more. "Are you looking for something special, sir?" he asked. "Yes, the head of a statue, made of red stone." "I see. Just the head. Okay." He started searching in the grass. There was a peepul tree about 100 yards away, under which a group of old men were sitting, smoking hookahs. The oldest among them asked Feluda, "Where are you from?" "Calcutta." "Your village hasn't come to any harm, has it?" "No, Babu. Allah saved us. There was a fire as soon as the plane came down. It made such a big noise that we all thought a bomb had gone off, and then the whole village was filled with smoke. We could see the fire in the wood, but none of us knew what to do. But soon it started to rain, and then the fire brigade arrived." "Did any of you go near the plane when the fire went out?" "No, Babu. We are old men. We were simply glad to have been spared." "What about the young boys? Didn't they go and collect things before the police got here?" The old men fell silent. By this time, several other people had gathered to listen to this exchange. Feluda spotted a boy and beckoned him. "What's your name?" he asked as the boy came closer. His tone was gentle and friendly. "Ali." Feluda placed a hand on his shoulder and lowered his voice. "A lot of things scattered everywhere when the plane crashed. You have seen that for yourself, haven't you? Now, there should have been the head of a statue among those things. Just the head of a statue of a woman. Do you know if anyone saw it?" "Ask him," Ali replied, pointing at another boy. Feluda had to repeat the whole process once more. "What's your name?" "Panu." "Did you see the head of a statue? Did you take it?" Silence. "Look, Panu," Feluda said even more gently. "It's all right. No one's gonna get angry with you. But if you can give me that head, I'll pay you for it. Have you got it with you?" More silence. This time, one of the old men shouted at him. "Go on, Panu. Answer the gentleman. He hasn't got all day." Panu finally opened his mouth. "I haven't got it with me now." "What do you mean?" "I found it, Babu. I swear I did. But I gave it to someone else, only a few minutes ago." "What? Could this really be true?" My heart started hammering in my chest. "Who was it?" Feluda asked sharply. "I don't know." "He was a man from the city, like you. He came in a car, a blue car." "What did he look like? Was he tall, short, thin, fat? Did he wear glasses?" This prompted many of Panu's friends to join the conversation. From the description they gave, it seemed that a man of medium height, who was neither thin nor fat, neither fair nor dark, and whose age was between 30 and 50, had arrived half an hour before us and had made similar inquiries. Panu had shown him the Yakshi's head, and he had bought it from him for a nominal sum. Then he had driven off in a blue car. When we were driving to Siddiqpur, a blue ambassador had come from the opposite direction, passed us, and gone towards the main road. All of us remembered having seen it. "Okay, come on, Topshe. Let's go, Mr. Ghosh." If Feluda was disappointed by what he had just learned, he did not show it. On the contrary, he seemed to have found new energy. He ran all the way back to the taxi, with the driver and me in tow. God knew what lay in store. Chapter 3. We were now going back the same way we had come. It was past 1:30, but neither of us was thinking of lunch. Balram Ghosh did suggest stopping for a cup of tea when we reached Jessore Road, but Feluda paid no attention. Perhaps our driver smelt an adventure in all this, so he too did not raise the subject of food again. Our car was now going at 75 kilometers per hour. I was aware of only one thought that kept going over and over in my mind. How close had we got to retrieving the Yakshi's head? If we hadn't had a power cut this morning, we would have heard the news on the radio, and then we would have reached Siddiqpur much sooner, and most certainly we would have got hold of Panu. If that had happened, by now we would have been making our way to the office of the Archaeological Survey of India. Who knows? Feluda might have been given a Padma Shri for recovering the country's lost heritage. The sun had already dried the road. I was beginning to wonder why we couldn't go a little faster, when my eyes caught sight of something by the roadside that caused a sharp rise in my pulse rate. A blue ambassador was standing outside a small garage. "Should I stop here, sir?" Balram Ghosh asked, reducing his speed. He had obviously paid great attention to what those boys had told us. "Yes, at the tea stall over there," Feluda replied. Mr. Ghosh swept up to the stall and pulled up by its side with a screech. We got out, and Feluda ordered 3 cups of tea. I noticed that tea was being served in small glasses. There were no cups. "What else have you got?" Feluda asked. "Biscuits. Would you like some?" "They are very fresh, sir, and very tasty." 2 glass jars stood on a counter, filled with large, round biscuits. Feluda asked for half a dozen of those. My eyes kept darting back to the blue car. A mechanic was in the process of replacing a punctured tire. A man, medium height, age around 40, thick bushy eyebrows, hair brushed back, was pacing up and down, inhaling every now and then from a half-finished cigarette. Our tea was almost ready. Feluda took out a charminaire, then pretended he had lost his lighter. He patted his pocket twice, then shrugged and moved over to join the other man. The driver and I stayed near our taxi, but we could hear what was said. "Excuse me," Feluda began. "Do you—" The man took out a lighter and lit Feluda's cigarette for him. "Thanks," Feluda inhaled. "A terrible business, wasn't it?" The man glanced at Feluda, then looked away without replying. Feluda tried once more. "Weren't you at the site where that plane crashed? I thought I saw your car there." This time, the man spoke. "What plane crash?" Good heavens! Haven't you heard? A plane bound for Kathmandu crashed near Siddiqpur. I am coming from Taki. No, I hadn't heard of the crash. Taki was a town near Hasnabad. Could the man be telling the truth? If only we had noted the number of his car when he passed us. How much longer will it take? He asked the mechanic impatiently. A couple of minutes, sir, no more. Our tea had been served by this time. Feluda came back to pick up a glass. The three of us sat down on a bench in front of the stall. He denied everything. The man's a liar, Feluda muttered. How can you be so sure, Feluda? There are millions of blue ambassadors. His shoes are covered by ash. Have you looked at your own sandals? I glanced down quickly and realized the color of my sandals had changed completely. The other man's brown shoes were similarly covered with dark patches. Feluda took his time to finish his tea. We waited until the blue car got a new tire. This took another 15 minutes instead of 2, and went towards Chisore Road. Our own taxi left a minute later. There was quite a big gap between the two cars, which, Feluda said, was no bad thing. He mustn't see that we are following him, he told Mr. Ghosh. It began raining again as we reached Dum-Dum. Everything went hazy for a few minutes, and it became difficult to keep the blue car in view. Balram Ghosh was therefore obliged to get a bit closer, which helped us in getting the number of the car. It was WMA 5349. This is like a Hindi film, sir, Mr. Ghosh enthused. I saw a film only the other day. It had Shatrughan Sinha in it, which had a chase scene exactly like this, but the second car went and crashed into a hill. We have already had a crash today, thank you. Oh, don't worry, sir. I've been driving for 13 years. I haven't had a single accident. I mean, not yet. Good. Keep it that way. Balram Ghosh was a good driver, I had to admit. We were now back in Calcutta, but he was weaving his way through the busy roads without once losing sight of the blue car. I wondered where it was going. What do you think the man is going to do with the statue? I asked Feluda after a while. Well, he's certainly not going to take it back to Bhubaneswar, Feluda replied. What he might do is find another buyer. After all, it isn't often that one gets the chance to sell the same thing twice. The blue car finally brought us to Park Street. We drove past the old cemetery, Loudon Street, Kamak Street, and then suddenly it turned left and drove into a building called Queen's Mansion. Should I go in, sir? Of course. Our taxi passed through the front gates. A huge open square faced us, surrounded by tall blocks of flats. A number of cars and a couple of scooters were parked before these. The blue car went to the far end and stopped. We waited in our taxi to see what happened next. The man got out with a black bag, wound up the windows of his car, locked it, and slipped into Queen's Mansion through a large door. Feluda waited for another minute, then followed him. By the time we reached the door, the old-fashioned lift in the lobby had already gone up, making a great deal of noise. It came back a few seconds later. An old liftman emerged from behind its collapsible gate. Feluda went up to him. Did I just miss Mr. Sengupta? He asked anxiously. Mr. Sengupta? The man who just went up? That man was Mr. Malik of number 5. There is no Sengupta in this building. Oh, I must have made a mistake. Sorry. We came away. Mr. Malik, flat number 5. I must remember these details. Feluda paid Balaram Ghosh and said he was no longer needed. Before driving off, he gave us a piece of paper with a phone number scribbled on it. That's my neighbour's number, he said. If you ever need me, ring that number. My neighbour will call me. I'd love to be able to help, sir. You see, life is usually so boring that something like this comes as a tremendous... it makes a change, doesn't it? We made our way to the Park Street police station. Feluda knew its OC, Mr. Harain Mutsuddi. 2 years ago, they had worked together to trace the culprit who had poisoned a racehorse called Happy-Go-Lucky. It turned out that Mr. Mutsuddi was aware of the theft in Bhubaneswar. Feluda told him briefly about our encounter with Mr. Malik and said, "Even if Malik is not the real thief, he has clearly taken it upon himself to recover the stolen object and pass it on to someone else. I have come to make 2 requests, Mr. Mutsuddi. Someone must keep an eye on his movements, and I need to know who he really is and where he works. He lives in flat number 5, Queen's Mansion, drives a blue Ambassador, WMA 5349. Mr. Mutsuddi heard Feluda in silence. Then he removed a pencil that was tucked behind his ear and said, "Very well, Mr. Mitter. If you want these things done, they will be done. A special constable will follow your man everywhere, and I'll see if we have anything in our files on him. There's no guarantee, mind you, that I'll get anything, particularly if he hasn't actually broken the law." "Thank you, but please treat this matter as urgent. If that statue gets passed on to someone else, we'll be in big trouble." "Why?" Mr. Mutsuddi smiled. "Why should you be in big trouble, Mr. Mitter? You'll have me and the entire police force to help you. Doesn't that count for anything? We are not totally useless, you know. But there's just one thing I'd like to tell you. The people who are behind such rackets are usually quite powerful. I'm not talking of physical strength. I mean, they often manage to do things far worse and much more vile than ordinary petty criminals. I'm telling you all this, Mr. Mitter, because you are young and talented, and I look upon you as a friend." "Thank you, Mr. Mutsuddi. I appreciate your concern." We left the police station and went to the Chinese restaurant Waldorf to have lunch. Feluda went to the manager's room to make a call after we had placed our order. "I rang Malik," he said when he came back. He was still in his room and he answered the phone himself. I rang off without saying anything. He sounded a little relieved. We returned home at 3 o'clock. Mr. Mutsuddi called us a little after 4. Feluda spoke for nearly 5 minutes, noting things down in his notebook. Then he put the phone down and told me everything even before I could ask. "The man is called Giant Malik. He moved into that flat about 2 weeks ago. It actually belongs to Mr. Adhikari, who is away in Darjeeling at the moment. Perhaps he's a friend, and he's allowed Malik to use his flat in his absence. That blue Ambassador is Adhikari's. Malik took it to the Grand Hotel at 3 o'clock today. He went in for 5 minutes, then came out and was seen waiting in his car for 20 minutes. After that, he went in once more and emerged in 10 minutes. Then he went to Dalhousie Square. Mutsuddi's man lost him for a while after this, but then found him in the railway booking office in Fairley Place. He bought a ticket to Aurangabad, 2nd class reserved. Mutsuddi's men will ring him again if there is more news." "Aurangabad?" "Yes, that's where Malik is going. and we are going immediately to Sardar Shankar Road to visit Uncle Sidhu. I need to consult him urgently. Chapter 4. Aurangabad. Uncle Sidhu's eyes nearly popped out. Do you realize what this means? Aurangabad is only 20 miles from Ellora, which is a sort of depot for the best specimens of Indian art. There is the Kailash temple, carved out of a mountain. Then there are 33 caves, Hindu, Buddhist, Jain, that stretch for a mile and a half. Each is packed with beautiful statues, wonderful carvings. Oh God, I can hardly think. But why is this man going by train when he can fly to Aurangabad? I think he wants to keep the Yakshi's head with him at all times. If he went by air, his baggage might be searched by security men. No one would bother to do that on a train, would they? Feluda stood up suddenly. What did you decide? Uncle Sidhu asked anxiously. We must go by air, Feluda replied. The look Uncle Sidhu gave him at this was filled with pride and joy, but he said nothing. All he did was get up and select a slim book from one of his bookcases. This may help you, he said. I glanced at its title. A Guide to the Caves of Ellora, it said. Feluda rang his travel agent, Mr. Bakshi, as soon as we got back home. I need 3 tickets on the flight to Bombay tomorrow, I heard him say. This surprised me very much. Why did he need 3 tickets? Was Uncle Sidhu going to join us? When I asked him, however, Feluda only said, the more the merrier. We may need an extra pair of hands. Mr. Bakshi came back on the line. I'll have to put you on the waiting list, he said. But it doesn't look too bad. I think it'll be okay. He also agreed to make our hotel bookings in Aurangabad and Ellora. The flight to Bombay would get us there by 9 o'clock. Then we'd have to catch the flight to Aurangabad at 12:30, reaching there an hour later. This meant we would arrive in Aurangabad on Saturday, and Mr. Malik would get there on Sunday. Feluda rang off and began dialing another number. The doorbell rang before he could finish dialing. I opened it to find Lal Mohan Babu. Feluda stared, as though he had seen a ghost, and exclaimed, My word, what a coincidence! I was just dialing your number. Really? Now that must mean I've got a telepathic link with you after all. Lal Mohan Babu laughed, looking pleased. Neither of us had the heart to tell him the correct word was telepathic. It's so hot and stuffy. Could you please ask your servant to make a lemon drink with some ice from the fridge, if you don't mind? Feluda passed on his request to Srinath, then came straight to the point. Are you very busy these days? Have you started writing anything new? No. I couldn't have come here for a chat if I had already started writing. All I've got is a plot. I think it would make a good Hindi film. There are 5 fights. My hero, Prakhar Rudra, goes to Baluchistan this time. Tell me, how do you think Arjun Mehrotra would handle the role of Prakhar Rudra? I think he'd fit the part very well. Unless, of course, you agreed to do it, Fellow Babu. I cannot speak Hindi. Anyway, I suggest you come with us to Kailash for a few days. You can start thinking of Baluchistan when you get back. Kailash? All the way to Tibet? Isn't that under the Chinese? No, this Kailash has nothing to do with Tibet. Have you heard of Ellora? Oh, I see. You mean the temple? But isn't that full of statues and rocks and mountains? What have you to do with those, Feluda? Your business is human beings, isn't it? Correct. A group of human beings has started a hideous racket involving those rocks and statues. I intend to put a stop to it. Lal Mohan Babu stared. Feluda filled him in quickly, which made him grow even more round-eyed. What are you saying, Feluda? I had no idea stone statues could be so valuable. The only valuable stones I can think of are precious stones like rubies and emeralds and diamonds. But this is far more precious. You can get diamonds and rubies elsewhere in the world, but there is only one Kailash, one Sanchi, and one Elephanta. If these are destroyed, there would be no evidence left of the amazing heights our ancient art had risen to. Modern artists do not, they cannot, get anywhere near the skill and perfection these specimens show. Anyone who tries to disfigure any of them is a dangerous criminal. In my view, the man who took that head from the statue of the Yakshi is no less than a murderer. He has got to be punished. This was enough to convince Lal Mohan Babu. He was fond of travelling, in any case. He agreed to accompany us at once, and began asking a lot of questions, including whether or not he should carry a mosquito net, and was there any danger of being bitten by snakes. Then he left, with a promise to meet us at the airport. Neither of us knew how long we might have to stay in Aurangabad, but decided to pack enough clothes for a week. Since Feluda was often required to travel, he always had a suitcase packed with essentials such as a 50-foot steel tape, an all-purpose knife, rail and air timetables, road maps, a long nylon rope, a pair of hunting boots, and several pieces of wire which came in handy to unlock doors and table drawers if he didn't have a key. None of this took up a lot of space, so he could pack his clothes in the same suitcase. He also had guidebooks and tourist pamphlets on various parts of the country. I leafed through the ones I thought might be relevant for this visit. Feluda set the alarm clock at 4 a.m. before going to bed at 10 o'clock, then rang 173 and asked for a wake-up call, in case the alarm did not go off for some reason. 10 minutes later, Mr. Mutsaddi rang again. Malik received a trunk call from Bombay, he said. The words Malik spoke were these: The daughter has returned to her father from her in-laws. The father is taking her with him 2075. The caller from Bombay said, Carry on, best of luck. That was all. Feluda thanked him and rang off. Malik's words made no sense to me. When I mentioned this to Feluda, he simply said, Even the few grey sails you had seem to be disappearing, my boy. Stop worrying and go to sleep. The flight to Bombay was delayed by an hour. It finally left at 7:30. There were quite a few cancellations, so we got 3 seats pretty easily. Lal Mohan Babu had flown with us for the first time when we had gone to Delhi and Shimla in connection with Mr. Dhameja's case. This was possibly the second time he was travelling by air. I noticed that this time he did not pull faces and grip the arms of his chair when we took off. But, a little later, when we ran into some rough weather, he leant across and said, Feluda, this is no different from travelling in a rickety old bus down Chitpur Road. How can I be sure the whole plane isn't coming apart? It isn't, rest assured. After breakfast, he seemed to have recovered a little, for I saw him press a button and call the air hostess. Excuse, please, miss. A toothpick, he said smartly. Then he began reading a guidebook on Bombay. None of us had been to Bombay before. Feluda had decided to spend a few days there with a friend on our way back, provided, of course, that our business in Elora could be concluded satisfactorily. When the fasten seatbelt sign came on just before landing, there was something I felt I had to ask Feluda. "Will you please explain what Mr. Malik's words meant?" Feluda looked amazed. "What? You mean you really didn't understand it?" "No. The daughter has returned to her father from her in-laws. The daughter is the Yakshi's head. The in-laws refers to Silverstein, who had bought it, and the father is Malik himself." "I see. What about 2075? "That refers to the latitude. If you look at a map, you'll see that's where Aurangabad is shown." We landed at Santa Cruz Airport at 10. Since our flight to Aurangabad was at 12:30, we saw no point in going into the town, although an aerial view of the city had impressed me very much. We remained in the airport, had chicken curry and rice for lunch at the airport restaurant, and boarded the plane to Aurangabad at 1:45. There were only 11 passengers, since it was not the tourist season. This time, Lalmohan Babu and I sat together. Feluda sat on the other side of the aisle, next to a middle-aged man with a parrot-like nose, thick wavy salt and pepper hair brushed back, and wearing glasses with a heavy black frame. We got to know him after landing at the small airport at Aurangabad. He was expecting to be met, he said, but no one had turned up. So he decided to join us to go to town in the bus provided by the airline. "Where will you be staying?" he asked Feluda. "Hotel Aurangabad." "Oh, that's where I shall be staying as well. What brings you here? Holiday?" "Yes, you might call it that. And you?" "I am writing a book on Elora. This is my second visit. I teach the history of Indian art in Michigan." "I see. Are you students enthusiastic about this subject?" "Yes, much more now than they used to be. India seems to inspire young people more than anything else." "I believe the Vaishnavas have got a strong hold over there?" Feluda asked lightly. The other gentleman laughed. "Are you talking about the Hare Krishna people?" he asked. "Yes, their presence cannot be ignored. They are, in fact, very serious about what they do and how they dress. Have you heard their kirtan? Sometimes it's impossible to tell they're foreigners." It took us only 15 minutes to reach our hotel. It was small, but neat and tidy. We checked in and were shown into room number 11. Lalmohan Babu went to room 14. Feluda had bought a newspaper at Bombay Airport. I had seen him read it in the plane. Now he sat down on a chair in the middle of our room, spread it once more, and said, "Do you know what vandalism means?" I did, but only vaguely. Feluda explained. The barbarian invaders who sacked Rome in the 5th century were called Vandals. Any act related to disfiguring, damaging, or destroying a beautiful object has come to be known as vandalism. Then he passed the newspaper to me and said, "Read it." I saw a short report with the heading, "More Vandalism." According to it, a statue of a woman had been broken and its head lifted from one of the walls of the temple of Kandarya Mahadev in Khajuraho. A group of art students from Baroda who went visiting the complex were the first to notice what had happened. This was the 3rd case reported in the last 4 weeks. There could be no doubt that these statues and other pieces of sculpture were being sold abroad. As I sat trying to grasp the full implication of the report, Feluda spoke. His tone was grim. "As far as I can make out," he said, there is only one octopus. It has spread its tentacles to various temples in different parts of the country. If even one tentacle can be caught and chopped off, it will make the whole body of the animal squirm and wriggle. It should be our aim here to spot that one tentacle and seize it. Chapter 5. Aurangabad was a historical city. An Abyssinian slave called Malik Amber had been brought to India. In time, he became the Prime Minister of the King of Ahmednagar and built a city called Karki. During the time of Aurangzeb, Karki changed its name and came to be known as Aurangzeb. In addition to Mughal buildings and structures, there were about 10 Buddhist caves, 1300 years old, that contained statues worth seeing. The gentleman we had met at the airport, whose name was Shubhankar Bose, came to our room later in the evening for a chat. "You must see the caves here before going to Ellora," he told us. "If you do, you'll be able to see that the two are similar in some ways." Since it was drizzling outside, we decided not to go out immediately. Tomorrow, if the day was fine, we would see the caves and the mausoleum built in the memory of Aurangzeb's wife, called Bibi Ka Maqbara. We would have to remain in Aurangabad until the next afternoon anyway, since Giant Malik was supposed to get here at 11 o'clock. He would probably go to Ellora the same day, and we would then follow him. After dinner, Feluda sat down with his guidebook on Ellora. I was wondering what to do when Lal Mohan Babu turned up. "Have you looked out of the window, Tapej?" he asked. "The moon has come out now. Would you like to go for a walk?" "Sure." We came out of the hotel to find everything bathed in the moonlight. In the distance was a range of hills. Perhaps that was where the Buddhist caves were located. A pawn shop close by had a transistor on, playing a Hindi song. 2 men were sitting on a bench, having a loud argument. They were probably speaking in Marathi, for I couldn't understand a word. The road outside had been full of people and traffic during the day, but was now very quiet. A train blew its whistle somewhere far away, and a man wearing a turban went past, riding a cycle. I felt a little strange in this new place. There seemed to be a hint of mystery in whatever I saw, some excitement and even a little fear. At this moment, Lal Mohan Babu suddenly brought his face close to my ear and whispered, "Doesn't Shubhankar Bose strike you as a bit suspicious?" "Why?" I asked, considerably startled. "What do you think his suitcase contains? Why does it weigh 35 kilograms? 35? I was very surprised. Yes, he was before me in the queue in Bombay when we were told to check in. I saw how much his suitcase weighed. His was 35, your cousin's was 22, yours was 14, and mine was 16 kilograms. Both had to pay for excess baggage." This was news to me. I had seen Mr. Bose's suitcase. It wasn't very large. What could have made it so heavy? Lal Mohan Babu provided the answer. "Rocks," he said, still whispering, "or tools to break something made of stone. Didn't your cousin tell us there was a large gang working behind this whole business? I believe Bose is one of them. Did you see his nose? It's exactly like Ghanshyam Karkat's." "Who is Ghanshyam Karkat?" "Oh no, didn't I tell you? He is the villain in my next book. Do you know how I'm going to describe his nose? It was like a shark's fin, rising above the water." I paid no attention to this last bit, but couldn't ignore his remarks about Mr. Bose. I would not have suspected him at all. How could a man who knew so much about art be a criminal? But then, those who go about stealing art must know something about the subject. Besides, there really was something sharp about his appearance. I only wanted to warn you, Lal Mohan Babu went on speaking. Just keep an eye on him. He offered me a toffee, but I didn't take it. What if it was poisoned? Tell your cousin not to let on that he is a detective. If he does, his life may be at risk. The next day, we left in a taxi at 6:30 in the morning and went to see Bibi Ka Maqbara, also known as the second Taj Mahal. Then we went to the Buddhist caves. The taxi dropped us at the bottom of a hill. A series of steps led us to the caves. Mr. Bose had accompanied us and was talking constantly about ancient art, most of which went over my head. I still couldn't think of him as a criminal, but caught Lal Mohan Babu giving him sidelong glances. This often made him stumble, but he did not stop. 2 other men had already gone into the caves. I had seen them climbing the steps before us. One of them was a bald American tourist, dressed in a colourful bush shirt and shorts. The other was a guide from the tourist department. Feluda took out his Pentax camera from his shoulder bag and began taking photos of the hills, the view, and occasionally of us. Each time he peered at us through his camera, Lal Mohan Babu stopped and smiled, looking somewhat self-conscious. After a while, I was obliged to tell him that he didn't necessarily have to stop walking, and in fact, photos often came out quite well, even if one didn't smile. When we reached the caves, Feluda suddenly said, "You two carry on. I'll join you in a minute. I must take a few photos from the other side." "Don't miss the 2nd and the 7th cave," Mr. Bose called out to us. "The first 5 are all in this area, but number 6 to 9 are half a mile away, on the eastern side. A road runs round the edge of the hill." The bright sun outside was making me feel uncomfortably hot, but once I stepped into the first cave, I realized it was refreshingly cool inside. But there wasn't much to see. It was obvious that it had been left incomplete, and what little work had been done had started to crumble. Even so, Mr. Bose began inspecting the ceiling and the pillars with great interest, jotting things down in his notebook. Lal Mohan Babu and I went into the 2nd cave. Feluda had given us a torch. We now had to switch it on. We were in a large hall, at the end of which was a huge statue of Buddha. I shone the torch on the walls, to find that beautiful figures had been carved on these. Lal Mohan Babu was silent for a few moments, taking it all in. Then he remarked, "Did you realize, Tapesh, how physically strong these ancient artists must have been? I mean, a knowledge of art and a creative imagination alone wasn't enough, was it? They had to pick up hammers and chisels and knock through such hard rock. Makes the mind boggle, doesn't it?" The 3rd cave was even larger, but the guide was speaking so loudly and rapidly that we couldn't stay in it for more than a few seconds. "Where did your cousin go?" Lal Mohan Babu asked as we emerged. "I can't see him anywhere." This was true. I had assumed Feluda would catch up with us, but he was nowhere to be seen. Nor was Mr. Bose. "Let's check the other caves," Lal Mohan Babu suggested. The 4th and the 5th caves were not far, but something told me Feluda had not gone there. I began to feel faintly uneasy. We started walking towards cave number 6, which was half a mile away. This side of the hill was barren and rocky. There were few plants apart from the occasional small bush. I glanced at my watch. It was only 8:15, but we could not afford to stay here beyond 10 o'clock, for Mr. Mullick was going to arrive at 11. 15 minutes later, we looked up and saw another cave. It was probably cave number 6. There was no way of telling whether Feluda had come this way. Lal Mohan Babu kept peering at the ground in the hope of finding footprints. It was a futile exercise, really, since the ground was absolutely dry. Was there any point in going any further? Might it help if we called his name? Feluda! Feluda! I started shouting. Pradosh Babu! Felu Babu! Mr. Mitter! Lal Mohan Babu joined me. There was no answer. I began to get a sinking feeling in the pit of my stomach. Had he climbed up the hill and gone to the other side? Had he seen or heard something that made him forget all about us? After a while, Lal Mohan Babu gave up. He's obviously nowhere here, he said, shaking his head, or he would have heard us. Let's go back. I'm sure we'll find him this time. He couldn't have left us without a word. He wouldn't do an irresponsible thing like that, would he? We turned back and retraced our steps. In a few minutes, we saw the foreigner and his guide making their way to the 6th cave. I could see that the American was finding it difficult to cope with the guide and his endless patter. Look! Here is Mr. Bose! Lal Mohan Babu cried. Mr. Bose was walking towards us with a preoccupied air. He raised his eyes as he heard his name. I went to him quickly and asked, Have you seen my cousin? No. Didn't he say he was going off to take pictures? Yes, but that was a long time ago. Maybe he's in one of these caves? No. I have been to each one of them. If he was there, I would certainly have seen him. Perhaps my face registered my anxiety, for his tone softened. He may have climbed a little higher. There is, in fact, a fantastic view of the whole city of Aurangabad if you can get to the top of the hill. Why don't you walk on and keep calling his name? He's bound to hear you sooner or later, Mr. Bose said reassuringly, and went off in the direction of cave number 6. Lal Mohan Babu lowered his voice. I don't like this, Tapesh, he said. I never thought there would be cause for anxiety even before we got to Ellora. I pulled myself together and kept walking. My speed had automatically become faster. All I could think of was that we were running out of time. We had to get back to the hotel by 11 to find out if Mr. Mullick had arrived. But what were we to do if we couldn't find Feluda? Without him... Charminar! Lal Mohan Babu cried suddenly, making me jump. We were standing near the pillars of the 5th cave. A yellow packet of Charminar was lying under a bush a few feet away from the pillars. It had either not been there when we were here earlier, or we had somehow missed it. Had it dropped out of Feluda's pocket? I picked it up quickly and opened its top. It was empty. Just as I was about to throw it away, Lal Mohan Babu said, Let me see, and took it from me. Then he opened it fully, and a small piece of paper slipped out. There was a brief message scribbled on it in Feluda's handwriting. Go back to the hotel, it said. Considerably relieved, we debated on what to do next. I couldn't think very clearly, as Feluda's message said nothing about where he was or why he was asking us to go back. The empty feeling in my stomach continued to linger. How can we go back? Lal Mohan Babu said. Mr. Bose is with us, and he has 4 more caves to see. Why don't we return to the hotel? I said slowly, forcing myself to think, and send the taxi back to fetch him. Yes, we could do that. But shouldn't we stay here to watch his movements? No, I don't think so, Lalmohn Babu. Feluda said nothing about Mr. Bose. He just wanted us to go back, and that's what we ought to do. Very well, so be it, Lalmohn Babu replied, sounding a little disappointed. Since he wrote mystery stories, Lalmohn Babu occasionally took it into his head to act like a professional sleuth. I could see that he wanted to follow Mr. Bose, but I felt obliged to stop him. Our taxi dropped us at the hotel, then went back to the caves. It was 9 o'clock. God knew how long we'd have to wait for Feluda. Neither of us could remain in our room, so we came out of the hotel and began strolling on the road outside. The sky had started to cloud over. If it rained, it might cool down a bit, I thought. Mr. Bose returned at 9:45 and looked rather puzzled when we told him Feluda had not returned. Naturally, we could not tell him the real reason why we were worried. After all, we did not know him well, and Lalmohn Babu was still convinced he was one of the criminals involved. In order to stop him from asking further questions, I said quickly, I'm afraid my cousin often does things without telling others. He has done this before. I mean, he has gone off like this, but has returned later. I'm sure he'll be back soon. We stayed out for nearly an hour. Then I went back to my room and began reading Tintin in Tibet. Just about 11, I thought I heard a train whistle, and at 11:45, a car drew up outside in the porch. Unable to contain myself, I went out to have a look. 2 men got out of the taxi. One of them was of medium height and pretty stout. His broad shoulders seemed to start just below his jaws. His neck was almost non-existent. For some reason, he seemed as if he might easily fly into a temper. The other man was just the opposite. Tall, lanky, wearing bell-bottoms and a loose cotton-embroidered shirt. His face was covered by an unkempt beard, and his hair rippled down to his shoulders. He looked like a hippie. The stout man had an old leather suitcase. The hippie had a new canvas bag. Both walked into the hotel. Another taxi arrived as soon as these men had gone in. Giant Malik got out of it. A sudden surge of relief swept over me. At least, this meant that we were on the right track. Our journey from Calcutta had not simply been a wild goose chase. But where on earth was Feluda? Chapter 6. I waited for another 10 minutes to see if Feluda turned up. When he didn't, I went in and knocked on Lalmohn Babu's door. He opened it at once and said with large round eyes, I've seen it all from the lobby. Don't both these characters look highly suspicious? I wonder if they'll go to Ellora. One of them, you know, the bearded one, might well be into ganja and other drugs. I nodded. Giant Malik has also arrived and checked in, I told him. Really? I didn't see him. I came back to my room as soon as that hippie walked in. What does Malik look like? When I described him, Lalmohn Babu grew even more excited. Oh, I think he's been given the room next to mine. I saw him arrive and something struck me as very odd. A bearer was carrying his suitcase, but it was obviously extremely heavy. The poor man could hardly move. And no wonder. Isn't the Yakshi's head supposed to be in it? I could think of nothing except Feluda's disappearance. So I said, What is much more important now is finding Feluda. Never mind about Malik's suitcase. We have made no arrangements to go to Ellora. Malik, I'm sure, hasn't come here simply to see the sights of Aurangabad. If he reaches Ellora before us, he might damage more. What's that? Lal Mohan Babu interrupted me, staring at the door. I had shut it after coming into the room. Someone had slipped a piece of paper under it. I leapt and grabbed it quickly. It was another note written by Feluda. Collect all our luggage and wait outside the hotel at 1:30. Look out for a black ambassador taxi, number 530. Have your lunch before you leave. All hotel bills have been paid in advance. I ran my eyes over these few lines and opened the door. There was no one in sight. A second later, however, Jayant Malik came out of his room and went busily towards the reception desk. He caught my eye briefly, but did not seem to recognize me. "He didn't lock his room," Lal Mohan Babu whispered. "There is no one about. Shall I go in and have a look? Think of the stolen statue." "No. We mustn't do anything like that without telling Feluda. It's nearly 1 o'clock now. I think we should both be getting ready to leave." Sometimes Lal Mohan Babu's enthusiasm caused serious problems. Luckily, he agreed to restrain himself. We had a quick lunch and came out with our luggage, including Feluda's, at 1:25. An empty taxi arrived in a few minutes, but it was green and had a different number. Its driver stopped it a few feet away from us. I saw him raise his arms and stretch lazily. 3 minutes later, another taxi drove up to us, a black ambassador, number 530. Its driver peered out of the window and said, "Mr. Mitter's party?" Yes, yes, Lal Mohan Babu replied with an important air. The driver got out and opened the boot for us. I put the 3 suitcases in it. 2 men came out of the hotel, Shubhankar Bose and Jayant Malik. I had seen them having lunch together. They got into the green taxi. It rode to life and shot off down Adalat Road, which headed west. Ellora lay in the same direction. All this suspense is going to kill me, I thought. Where are we going to go? Why wasn't Feluda with us? I couldn't help feeling annoyed with him for having vanished, although I knew very well he never did anything without a good reason. Another man emerged from the hotel. It was the tall hippie, carrying his canvas bag. He came straight to us, stopped, and said, "Get in, Topshe. Quick, Lal Mohan Babu." Before I knew it, I was sitting in the back of the taxi. The hippie opened the front door, pushed the bemused Lal Mohan Babu in, then got in beside me. "Chaliye, Dindalji," he said to the driver. I knew Feluda was good at putting on makeup and disguises, but had no idea he could change his voice, his walk, even the look in his eyes so completely. Lal Mohan Babu appeared to be speechless, but he did turn around and shake Feluda's hand. My heart was still speeding like a racehorse, and I was dying to know why Feluda was in disguise. Feluda opened his mouth only when we had left the main town and reached the open country. The disguise was necessary, he explained. Malik might have recognized me, although we had exchanged only a few words in that garage in Barasat. Naturally, his suspicions would have been aroused if he saw that the same man who had asked him awkward questions was also going to Ellora. I didn't tell you about my plan, for I wanted to see if my makeup was good enough. When neither of you recognized me, I knew I didn't have to worry about Malik. I had these clothes and everything else in my shoulder bag this morning. When I said I was going to take photos, I actually walked ahead and disappeared into cave number 6. Not many people go in there, since it's far from the others and one has to climb higher to get there. When I finished, I climbed down and walked back to town. First I arranged a taxi, then went to the station to see if Malik got off the train. When he did, I followed his taxi, having collected another passenger who also wanted to go to our hotel. This helped me as I could then share the taxi fare with him. Now, if Shivankar Bose asks you anything about me, tell him I've sent you a message saying I had to go to Bombay on some urgent business. I cannot remove my disguise until I go to bed. In fact, we shouldn't even let Malik see that you and I know each other. You and Lal Mohan Babu will share a room. I will be in a separate room wherever we stay. But who are you? You don't have to bother with a name. I'm a photographer. I'm here to take photos for the Asia magazine of Hong Kong. Okay. What about Lal Mohan Babu and myself? You are his nephew. He teaches history in the city college. You are a student in the city school. You are interested in painting, but you want to join your uncle's college next year to study history. Your name is Tapesh Mukherjee. Lal Mohan Babu need not change his name, but please read up on Ellora. Basically, all you need to remember is that the Kailash temple was built during the reign of Raja Krishna of the Rashtrakud dynasty in the 8th century. Lal Mohan Babu repeated these words to himself, then took out his little red notebook and noted them down, although writing wasn't easy in the moving car. Now I could see why Feluda had asked him to come with us. He must have known he would have to be in disguise and pretend he didn't know me. Lal Mohan Babu's presence ensured that there was an extra pair of eyes to check on Malik's movements, and I had an adult to accompany me. I didn't mind having to call Lal Mohan Babu uncle, but pretending Feluda was a total stranger was going to be most difficult. Well, I had no choice. I looked out of the window. There were hills in the distance, and the land on either side of the road was dry and barren. Cactus grew here and there, but it was a different kind of cactus, not the familiar prickly pear I had seen elsewhere. These bushes were larger and taller by several feet. Another car behind us had been honking for some time. Our driver slowed down slightly to let it pass. It had the bald American we had seen in the morning, and the stout man who had travelled with Feluda in the same taxi. Half an hour later, we found ourselves getting closer to the distant hills. To our left stretched a small town called Khuldabad. We were going to stay in the Dak bungalow here. At any other time, it would have been impossible to find rooms at such short notice. Thank goodness it was not the regular tourist season. However, the absence of tourists also meant that the thieves and vandals could have a field day. A little later, to our right, the first of the many caves of Ellora came into view. To the Dak bungalow? Our driver asked. Or would you like to see the caves first? No, let's go straight to the Dak bungalow, Feluda replied. Our car made a left turn where the road curved towards Khuldabad. I was still staring at the rows of caves in the hills. Which one of them was Kailash? There were 2 major places to stay in Khuldabad. One was the Dak bungalow where we were booked, and the other was the more expensive and posh tourist guest house. The 2 stood side by side, separated by a strong fence. I spotted the green taxi standing outside the guest house, which meant that was where Jayant Malik had checked in. Our bungalow was smaller, but neat and compact. Feluda paid the driver, then asked him to wait for 15 minutes. We would leave our things in our rooms and go to Kailash. The driver could drop us there and return to Aurangabad. There were 4 rooms in the bungalow. Each had 3 beds. Feluda could have remained with us, but decided to take a separate room. "Remember," he whispered before he left us, "your surname is Mukherjee. Lal Mohan Babu is your uncle. Rashtrakud dynasty, 8th century, Raja Krishna. I'll join you in 10 minutes. Then he went into his own room and shouted, "Chowkidar," in a voice that was entirely different from his own. Lal Mohan Babu and I had a quick wash and went into the dining hall, where we were supposed to wait for Feluda. We found another gentleman in it, the same man we had just seen travelling with the American. Clearly, he was going to stay in the bungalow with us. At first, he had struck me as a boxer or a wrestler. Now I noticed his eyes. They were bright and intelligent, which suggested he was educated and, in fact, might well be a writer or an artist, for all I knew. His eyes twinkled as they caught mine. "Off to Kailash, are you?" he asked with a smile. Yes, yes," Lal Mohan Babu replied eagerly. "We are from Calcutta. I'm professor of history in the City College, and this is my nephew, you see." There was no need to tell him anything else, but possibly because he was nervous about playing a new role, Lal Mohan Babu went on speaking. "I thought, that we must see this amazing creation of the Koot dynasty. My nephew is, very interested in art. He wants to get into an art college. He paints quite well, Bhutto, don't forget to take your drawing book." I said nothing in reply, for I had not brought my drawing book. Thankfully, Feluda came out at this moment and glanced casually at us. "If any one of you want to go to the caves, you may come with me. I've still got my taxi," he said in his new voice. "Oh, thank you. That's very kind." Lal Mohan Babu turned to him, looking relieved. Then curtsy made him turn back to the other gentleman. "Would you like to come with us?" he asked. "No, thank you. I'll go later. I must have a bath first." We went out of the bungalow. "Tell me a bit more about the history of this place, Felu Babu," Lal Mohan Babu pleaded in a low voice. "I can't manage unless I have a few more details." "Do you know the names of different periods in Indian history?" Such as Maurya, Sangha, Gupta, Kushan, Chola, things like that?" Lal Mohan Babu turned pale. Then, getting into the taxi, he said, "Tell you what, why don't I pretend to be deaf? Then, if anyone asks me anything about the history of the caves or anything else I might find difficult to answer, I can simply ignore them. Isn't that a good idea?" "All right. I have no objection to that. But remember, your acting must be consistent at all times." "No problem with that. Anything would be better than trying to remember historical facts. Didn't you see how I messed things up just now? I mean, saying put instead of could was hardly the right thing to do, was it?" We were passing the guest house. Jayant Malik was standing outside, his hands in his pockets, staring at our bungalow. The green ambassador was still parked by the road. On seeing Mr. Malik, Feluda took out a small comb from his bag and passed it to me. "Change your parting," he said. "Make a right parting." I looked at myself in the rear-view mirror and quickly changed the parting in my hair as Feluda suggested. Who knew a little thing like that would make such a lot of difference? Even to my own eyes, my face looked different. We reached the main road. Another road rose up the hill from here, curved around, and finally brought us to the famous Kailash temple. We got out here, and the taxi returned to Aurangabad. At first, I didn't realize what the temple was like. However, as soon as I had passed through its huge entrance, my head began reeling. For a few moments, I forgot all about the Yakshi's head, the gang of crooks, Mr. Malik, Shubhankar Bose, everything. All I was aware of was a feeling of complete bewilderment. I closed my eyes and tried to imagine a group of men carving the whole temple out of the hill 1200 years ago, using no other tools but hammers and chisels. But I could not. It seemed as if the temple had always been there. It couldn't be man-made at all. Or maybe it had been created by magic. Or perhaps, as Feluda's book had suggested, creatures from a different planet had come and built it. The temple had hills rising on 3 sides. A narrow passage went round it. On both sides of the temple were a number of caves that looked like cells, which had more statues in them. We started walking down the passage to go round the temple. Feluda kept up a running commentary. This place is 300 feet in length, 150 feet in width, and the height of the temple is 100 feet. 200,000 tons of rock must have been excavated to build it. They built the top first, then worked their way down to the base. The statues include gods and goddesses, men and women, animals, events from the Ramayana and the Mahabharata, the lot. Just think of their skill, the precision of their calculations, their knowledge of engineering, quite apart from the aesthetics. He stopped. There were footsteps coming towards us. Feluda fell behind deliberately and began inspecting the statue of Ravana shaking Kailash. Shubhankar Bose emerged from behind the temple. In his hand was a notebook, and a bag hung from his shoulder. He seemed engrossed in looking at the carvings. Then his eyes fell on us. He smiled, then seemed to remember something and asked anxiously, "Any news of your cousin?" "Yes," I replied, trying to sound casual. "He sent a message. He had go to Bombay on some urgent work. He'll be back soon." "Oh, good." Mr. Bose went back to gazing at the statues. A faint click behind us told me Feluda had taken a picture. His camera was hanging from his neck. If he was to pass himself off as a photographer, the camera naturally had to stay with him whenever he went out. I turned my head slightly and saw that Feluda was following us. We finished walking round the temple and had almost reached the main entrance again when we saw someone else. Blue shirt, white trousers. Mr. Jayant Malik. He had probably just arrived. He was standing quietly, but moved towards the statue of an elephant as soon as he saw us. In his hand was the same bag I had seen him carrying before. He had travelled from Barasat to Calcutta with it. I had seen him walk into Queen's Mansion, clutching it. Feluda had now almost caught up with us. I was dying to know what that bag contained. Why didn't Feluda go up to the man, grab him by his collar, and challenge him straight away? Why didn't he say, "Where's that broken head? Take it out at once"? But no, I knew Feluda would not do that. He could not, without sufficient evidence. It was true that Malik had gone to Siddiqpur, where that plane had crashed. It was true that he had travelled all the way to Ellora and had been heard speaking to someone in Bombay, talking about a daughter having returned to her father. But that was not really enough. Feluda would have to wait a bit longer before speaking to him. There was, however, one way of finding out if Malik's bag contained anything heavy. I saw Feluda walk past us, go up to Malik, and give him a push. "Oh, sorry," he said quickly, and began focusing his camera on a statue. I saw the bag swing from side to side with the push. Its contents did not appear to be very heavy. We left the temple. On our way out, we saw two other men. One of them was the stout gentleman Lal Mohan Babu had recently tried to impress, and the other was the bald American. The former was explaining something with elaborate gestures. The latter was nodding in agreement. For some strange reason, I suddenly began to think everyone around us was a suspicious character. Each one of them should be watched closely. Was Feluda thinking the same thing? Chapter 7. Feluda wanted to stop at the guest house on our way back. "I want to see what newspapers they get," he said by way of an explanation. Lal Mohan Babu and I returned to the bungalow. We were both feeling hungry, so Lal Mohan Babu called out to the chowkidar and asked him to bring us tea and biscuits. The dining room faced the small lobby. The room to its right, number 1, was ours. Number 2 was empty. Opposite these two were rooms 3 and 4. The stout gentleman was in one of them, and Feluda had the other. Lal Mohan Babu was still in a mood to snoop. "Listen, Tapesh," he said, sipping his tea. "I think we can leave the American out of this, at least for the moment. That leaves us with 3 other people. Bose, Malik, and that man who's staying here. We know something about Bose and Malik. True or false, God only knows. But we know absolutely nothing about the third man, not even his name. We could peep into his room now. It doesn't appear to be locked." I did not like the idea, so I said, "What if the chowkidar sees us?" "He cannot see us if I go in, and you stay here to look out for him. If you see the chowkidar coming this way, start cuffing. I will get out of that room at once. I think your cousin will appreciate a helping hand. This man's suitcase also struck me as quite heavy." The whole world was suddenly full of heavy suitcases, but I could not stop him. To be honest, although I had never done anything like this before for anyone except Feluda, there was a scent of adventure in the suggestion, so I found myself agreeing. I went to the back veranda. There was a small courtyard facing the veranda, across which was the kitchen, and next to it, the chowkidar's room. A cycle stood outside this room. A boy of about 12, presumably his son, was cleaning it with great concentration. I turned my head as I heard a faint creaking noise and saw Lal Mohan Babu sneak into room number 3. A couple of minutes later, it was he who coughed loudly to indicate that he had finished his job. I returned to our room. There was nothing much in there, Lal Mohan Babu said. His suitcase seemed pretty old, but it was locked and did not open even when I pulled the handle. On the table was an empty spectacle case with Stephen's Company, Calcutta, stamped on it, a bottle of indigestion pills, and a tube of Odomos. Apart from these things, there was nothing that I— "Whose possessions are you talking about?" asked Feluda. We looked up with a start. He had walked into our room silently, almost like a ghost. This called for an honest confession. Much to my surprise, he did not get cross with either of us. All he said was there any particular reason for doing this? No, it's just that we don't know anything about the man, do we? Lalmohun Babu tried to explain. I mean, he hasn't even told us his name, and he looks kind of hefty, doesn't he? Didn't you say there was a whole gang involved in this? So I thought... So you thought he must be one of them? There was no need to search his room just to get his name. He's called R.N. Rakshit. His name is written on one side of his suitcase. I don't think we need to know any more about him at this moment. Please don't go into his room again. It simply means taking unnecessary risks. After all, we haven't got any concrete reason to suspect him. Very well. That just leaves the American. He is called Lewison, Sam Lewison, another Jew and also very wealthy. He owns an art gallery in New York. How do you know all this? I asked, surprised. The manager of the guest house told me. We got talking. He's a very nice man, passionately fond of detective novels. In fact, he's been waiting for thieves and crooks to arrive here ever since he read about the thefts in our temples. Did you tell him why you were here? Yes. He can help us a great deal. Don't forget, Malik is staying in his guest house. Apparently, Malik has already tried to ring someone in Bombay, but the call didn't come through. That night, all 4 guests in the bungalow sat down to dinner together. Feluda did not speak a word. Mr. Rakshit turned to Lalmohun Babu and tried to make conversation by asking him if he specialized in any particular period of history. In answer to that, Lalmohun Babu said he didn't know very much about pyramids, except that they were in Egypt. Then he went back to dunking pieces of chapati in his bowl of dal. Mr. Rakshit cast me a puzzled glance. I placed a hand on my ear and shook my head to indicate that my uncle was hard of hearing. Mr. Rakshit nodded vigorously and refrained from asking further questions. After dinner, Feluda went straight to his room and Lalmohun Babu and I went out for a walk. It was quite windy outside. A pale moon shone between patches of dark clouds. From somewhere came the fragrance of Hasnahana. Lalmohun Babu, inspired by all this, decided to start singing a classical raga. I suddenly felt quite light-hearted. Just at that moment, we saw a man walking towards us from the guest house. Lalmohun Babu stopped singing, which was a relief since he was singing perfectly out of tune, and stood still. As the man got closer, I recognized him. It was Shubhankar Bose. I wish your cousin was here, Lalmohun Babu whispered. Out for a walk, eh? Mr. Bose asked. Then he cleared his throat, looked around a couple of times, lowered his voice and said, do you happen to know that man in the blue shirt? This time, Lalmohun Babu couldn't pretend to be deaf. Mr. Bose had spoken with him before. Why? Did he say he knew us? Lalmohun Babu asked. Mr. Bose looked over his shoulder again. That man is most peculiar, he told us. He says he's interested in Indian art and this is his first visit to Ellora. Yet, when I met him at the temple, he didn't seem moved by any of it. I mean, not at all. I felt just as thrilled by everything, even though this is my second visit. Now, if the man does not care for art and sculpture, why is he here? Why is he pretending to be something he clearly isn't? We remained silent. What could we say? Have you read the papers recently? Mr. Bose went on. Why do you ask? Pieces of our ancient art are being sold off. Statues from temples are disappearing overnight. Really? No, I didn't know that. What a shame. It's a regular crime, isn't it? Lalmohn Babu declared. His acting was not very convincing, but luckily Mr. Bose did not seem to notice. He came closer and added, The man left the guest house a while ago. Which man? Mr. Malik. What? We both spoke together. Lalmohn Babu was right. Feluda ought to have been here. Why don't we go too? Mr. Bose asked, his voice trembling with excitement. Now? Where to? Lalmohn Babu stammered. To the caves. But they must be closed now. Surely there are chowkidars. Yes, but there are only 2 guards for 34 caves, so that shouldn't be a problem. I saw Malik leave with a bag. He and that hippie in your bungalow keep going about with bags. In fact, that hippie also strikes me as suspicious. Do you know who he is? Lalmohn Babu nearly choked. He's a photographer, a very good one. He showed us some of his photos. He's here on an assignment. Someone came out of the bungalow. It was Mr. Rakshit, carrying a stout walking stick in one hand and a torch in the other. He was wearing a dark, heavy raincoat. He stopped for a minute to shout into Lalmohn Babu's ear, After dinner, walk a mile. Then he smiled and disappeared in the direction of the guest house. Mr. Bose said, Good night, and followed him. Lalmohn Babu frowned and said, Why did that man tell me to walk a mile? That should help your digestion. Come on now, let's go and find Feluda. He must be told what we just heard. Everyone seems to have gone off to the caves. I don't like it. Let's see what Feluda thinks. It was dark inside the bungalow, except for a lantern in the chowkidar's room. This surprised us. Mr. Rakshit had naturally switched off his light before going out, and so had we. But why was Feluda's door closed? Why couldn't I see any light under it? Had he already gone to sleep? It was only 10:30. His room had a window that opened out on the veranda. At this moment, however, it was firmly shut and the curtains drawn. I walked up to it and softly called out Feluda's name. There was no reply. He must have gone out. But if he had used the main exit, we would certainly have seen him. Perhaps he had gone out of the little back door behind the chowkidar's room? Rather foolishly, we went back to our own room and switched the light on. At once, our eyes fell on a piece of paper that was lying on the floor. Stay in your room, it said in Feluda's handwriting. Tapesh, my boy, Lalmohn Babu said with a sigh. Do you know what is worrying me the most? It's your cousin's behavior. That is what is more mystifying. Otherwise, frankly, I cannot see too many mysteries in this case. Feluda had told us to stay in, but had said nothing about when he might return. There was no question of going to bed, so I spent the next 30 minutes playing noughts and crosses with Lalmohn Babu. Then he said he'll tell me the plot of his next novel. This time, he announced, I've introduced a new type of fight. My hero's hands and feet are going to be tied, but he'll still manage to defeat the villain, simply by using his head. I was about to ask whether by this he meant Prokharudра's brain power, or was his hero simply going to butt his way to victory, when Feluda returned. We looked up expectantly, but he said nothing. By this time, We had both learned that if Feluda did not wish to part with information, even 1,000 questions couldn't make him open his mouth. On the other hand, he'd tell us everything if he so wished. What he finally said took us by surprise. "Lalmohan Babu?" he asked solemnly. "Did you bring a weapon this time?" Lalmohan Babu had a passion for collecting weapons. When we had gone to Rajasthan, he had taken a Nepali dagger with him. Then, when he went to Shimla, he had a boomerang. At Feluda's question, his eyes started glinting. "Yes, sir," he said. "This time, I've got a bomb." "A bomb?" I could hardly believe him. Lalmohan Babu opened his suitcase and took out a heavy brown object, shaped a little like a torch. He passed it to Feluda, saying, "My neighbor, Mr. Samodar's son, Utpal, is in the army. He came to my house last March and gave it to me. Look, uncle, see what I brought for you," he said. "This is a bomb. It is used in serious warfare. Utpal loves reading my novels." Feluda inspected it briefly before saying, "Let me keep this. It's too dangerous to remain anywhere else." "Very well. How many metaguns do you think it weighs?" What he meant obviously was megaton. But Feluda ignored this last remark completely. He put the bomb in his shoulder bag and said, "Let's go out. Everyone else has gone, so why should we stay in?" When we left the Dug bungalow, it was 11:30. The moon was now almost totally obliterated by clouds. It was still windy. One of the rooms in the guest house had a light on. It was the American's room, Feluda said. It was impossible to tell whether Bose and Malik had returned. By the time we reached the main road, the eastern sky was heavily overcast. A loud rumble in the sky made Lalmohan Babu exclaim, "Good heavens! What if we get caught in the rain?" "If we can get to the caves before it starts raining, we'll have plenty of places to seek shelter," Feluda reassured us. Fortunately, it remained dry for quite some time after this. We reached Kailash, but Feluda did not go in through the main entrance. He turned left instead. A little later, he left the path and began climbing up the hill. I was familiar enough with his techniques to realize that he was trying to see if there was another way to get into the temple without using the main passage. There were bushes and loose stones everywhere, but the moonlight, fleeting though it was, helped us find our way. Feluda turned right. We were now going back the way we came, but were walking several feet above the path that visitors normally used. A few minutes later, Feluda suddenly stopped. He was looking at something on his right. I followed his gaze. In the distance, it seemed as if a long silk ribbon was spread on the ground. It was the road that led to the main town. A man was quickly walking down this road, either to the guest house or to the bungalow. "Not Ruxit," Lalmohan Babu whispered. "How do you know?" "Ruxit was wearing a raincoat." He was right. The man turned a corner and vanished from sight. We resumed walking. Only a few moments later, however, we had to stop again. There was a strange noise, something like a cross between a scrape and a rustle. Where was it coming from? Feluda sat down. So did we. A large cactus bush hid us from view. The noise continued for some time, then stopped abruptly. We emerged cautiously. Huge dark clouds had now spread all over the sky. We could hardly see our way. Nevertheless, Feluda kept going. Soon we could vaguely see the temple again. Its spire was before us. Several feet below the spire, on the roof, stood 4 lions, facing the east, west, north, and south. Far below them were 2 elephants that stood at the entrance. We kept walking. The noise had come from this direction, but I couldn't see anything suspicious. Feluda had a torch, but I knew he wouldn't switch it on, in case it was seen by whoever happened to be in the vicinity. We passed the temple and came to a cave. It was cave number 15. We moved on to the next. Feluda stopped again. I could see that his whole body was tense. "Torch," he whispered. "Someone in number 15 has switched on a torch. Look at the courtyard in front of it. Doesn't it seem brighter than the others?" It was true. Neither Lalmohan Babu nor I had noticed it. Only Feluda's sharp eyes had picked it up. We stood holding our breath for a couple of minutes. Then Feluda did something entirely unexpected. He picked up a small pebble and threw it in the direction of the courtyard. I heard it fall with a soft thud. A second later, the faint light coming from the cave went out. The torch was switched off. Then the man came out and slipped away, moving stealthily like a thief. "Could that be Raksit?" Lalmohan Babu said softly. I couldn't recognize the man, but could see that he was not wearing a raincoat. What followed next took my breath away. Without a word of warning, Feluda began climbing down. He leapt, crawled, scraped himself on the ground, then swinging from a branch like a monkey, disappeared from sight. I stared speechlessly. Lalmohan Babu said, after a moment's silence, "He will do very well in a circus." Cave number 15 was at a lower level. That was where Feluda had gone. 3 minutes later, it felt like 3 hours, he climbed up again, more or less in a similar fashion. How he could do it with a torch in one hand, a bag hanging from his shoulder, and a revolver tucked into his waist, I do not know. "That one is the Das Avatar cave," he told us, panting. "It has 2 stories, and some exquisite statues." Did you see who it was?" I asked breathlessly. Feluda did not reply immediately. Then he said, "It's not as simple as I had thought. It'll take me a while to unravel this tangled mess." We both found the main path again and climbed down to the bottom of the temple. But Feluda had not finished. He found one of the chowkidars and asked him if he had seen anyone going up. "No, sir," the chowkidar replied. "Did you hear any noise? Anything suspicious at all?" "No, sir. There has been a lot of thunder. I didn't hear anything else." "Can we go into the temple?" I knew the man would refuse, and he did. "No, sir. I have orders not to let anyone in at this time of night." We made our way back to the bungalow. As we got closer, we saw something extremely strange. 2 windows on the eastern side of the building overlooked the street. We could see these from outside. One of them was Feluda's, the other was Mr. Rakshit's. Feluda's room was in darkness, but a light flashed in Mr. Rakshit's room. It was the light from a torch, but it did not stay still. In fact, whoever was holding it seemed to have gone mad. The light danced all over the room, then came to the window, shone once in the direction of the guest house, fell and moved on to the bushes by the road before going back to the room. We could not see who it was. "Highly interesting," Feluda muttered. We returned to the bungalow. By now, it had started to drizzle and was pitch dark outside. Chapter 8. I had noticed in the past that our adventures often took totally unexpected turns. When this happened, Feluda seldom lost his equanimity. In fact, I had always marvelled at his ability to keep calm while dealing with unforeseen complications. This time, however, what happened made him very cross. Before going to bed at night, we had decided to leave early in the morning to go back to the spot where we had heard that funny noise. It required investigation, Feluda said. So we rose at 5 o'clock and left the bungalow half an hour later after having a cup of tea. Feluda was up before us to replace his makeup. I remembered to maintain a right parting in my hair. Lal Mohan Babu expressed the desire to make some change in his appearance as well, but Feluda said no so firmly that he had to desist. The caves were going to open for visitors as soon as the sun rose. We wanted to be the first, so we got there at 6 a.m. To our complete astonishment, we found the place crawling with people. A large number of cars and vans were parked outside. It was the sight of a reflector that told me what was going on. This was a film unit. They had arrived from Bombay to shoot a Hindi film, we learnt. The actors hadn't yet arrived, but the rest of the crew were getting things ready. "Oh no!" Feluda cried in dismay. "Why couldn't they find some other place?" A young man was bustling about, clutching a film magazine. Lal Mohan Babu called him aside. "What is the name of this film? Do you know?" "Oh yes, Crorepati." "Who's acting in it?" "3 of the top stars. Today's shots will include Rupa, Arjun Mehrotra and Balwan Chopra. The heroine, hero and the villain." The mention of Arjun Mehrotra made Lal Mohan Babu grow round-eyed. "Will there be songs?" he asked. No. We've come to shoot fights. Stuntmen, doubles, and the fight director are all here. The hero will chase the villain from a cave into the main temple." "And the heroine?" "She'll stay in the cave. The villain has imprisoned her in there, you see. But now the hero is here, so the villain has to run for his life. The climax takes place on the spire." "The spire?" "Yes." "Who's the director?" "Mohan Sharma. But these shots today will be taken by the fight director, Appa Rao." "How long do you think the whole thing will take?" "Well, that's difficult to say. We hope to start by 10 o'clock. Then we should finish by 1. That meant they would occupy the whole complex virtually the whole day. "I don't believe this," Feluda said through clenched teeth. "How did they get permission to take the whole place over?" "Since we couldn't get into the temple, we decided to climb over it, just as we had done the previous night. But even the hills around the temple had men from the film unit setting up equipment. We learnt here that although the film crew were not letting ordinary visitors into the temple, they could not go in themselves, as the official letter giving them the necessary permission to shoot had not yet arrived. It was being brought in a different car. The chowkidar on duty had flatly refused to unlock the main door unless the letter was produced. Feluda clicked his tongue in annoyance and said, "Let's not waste any more time. Let's see if we can get into cave number 15. At least we can look at those beautiful statues, away from all this noise." We climbed down from the other side and were walking towards the cave when we saw a huge yellow American car making its way to the temple. The 3 major stars and the fight director had arrived. Feluda had already told us the 15th cave was the Dust Avatar cave. We ran into 2 modern avatars on our way. They were Lewison and Rakshit. We had spotted them from a distance, standing near the entrance and speaking rather animatedly. As we got closer, we heard the American say angrily, "I see no point in my staying here any longer." Then he strode off in a huff. Mr. Rakshit walked up to us, shrugged and smiled somewhat bitterly. He was complaining about the arrangements here. I mean, in the guest house. He said to me, "How can you expect me to spend my dollars here when you don't even know how to fry an egg?" Just because he's rich, he thinks he owns the whole world. "That's strange," Feluda remarked. "Isn't he supposed to be a connoisseur of art? How can he talk of fried eggs standing in a place like this, surrounded by the best specimens of Indian art?" How, Lal Mohan Babu wanted to know, do they fry eggs in America, anyway? Mr. Rakshit opened his mouth to speak, but had to shut it immediately. A loud scream from the temple made us all start violently. Lal Mohan Babu was the first to recover. "That must be the villain," he exclaimed. "They have started shooting. The villain is shouting and making his escape." But no, a babel had broken out. There were many other voices, also screaming and yelling. There was something wrong, obviously. Feluda had already begun walking in that direction. We followed him quickly. As we returned to the temple's entrance, we saw a man in a purple bush shirt being carried out. He appeared to be unconscious. He was taken to the yellow car. Then came the 3 stars. Rupa was walking slowly, leaning heavily on Arjun Mehrotra. Balwant was holding her hand and murmuring into her ear, as if she were a frightened child in need of comforting. A second later, we saw the same young man we had spoken to earlier. "What happened? What's wrong?" Lal Mohan Babu asked him. There is a dead body lying behind the temple. It's horrible." "Oh my God! Who was that man they carried out to the car?" "Abba Rao. He was the first to discover the body. One look and he fainted." Feluda and Mr. Rakshit had gone into the temple. The film crew were all coming out. There was now no question of shooting a film here today. Lal Mohan Babu and I walked along the passage to our left. To our right, below us, were several statues of elephants and lions. They looked as though they were carrying the whole temple on their shoulders. We stopped as the passage turned right. There was a group of men peering down into a gorge. Perhaps that was where the body was lying. Mr. Rakshit emerged from the crowd and stopped us. "Don't go any further," he said. "It's not a pretty sight." Quite frankly, I had no wish to see the body, but I did feel curious about the dead man. Who was he? Feluda came out and answered this question even before I could ask it. "Shubhankar Bose," he said. "I think he fell off the edge of the cliff straight onto the rocks below." "Strange, how strange," Lal Mohan Babu muttered under his breath. "This is exactly how my own villain, Ghanshyam Karkat, is supposed to die." Feluda started walking away, so Lal Mohan Babu and I had to move on. Mr. Rakshit was ahead of us, but he turned and stopped. "I saw him last night," he said, shaking his head. I told him not to try climbing in the dark, but he paid no attention to me. How was I to know that he was planning to commit suicide? Mr. Rakshit left, having given us something to ponder on. The idea of his suicide had not occurred to me. I looked at Feluda, but he had started to climb the hill on the left of the temple. Mr. Bose must have climbed the same hill. The people gathered near the cliff had gone. Mr. Bose's death had, in a way, made things easier for our investigation. Feluda went close to the edge of the cliff and examined the area carefully. There was a small hole in the ground, only a few feet away from the edge. People had walked over it and around it, making it almost disappear. But when Feluda took out a steel tape from his bag and pushed it in, we realized it was a fairly deep hole. Now Feluda peered closely at the ground again. Lal Mohan Babu and I both saw what had claimed his attention. There was a deep crease on the ground, running from the edge of the cliff to the hole. "Do you know what this is?" Feluda asked me. I couldn't answer. Feluda went on. This mark was left by a rope. Someone had tied a rope to a crowbar, dug the crowbar deep into the ground, and gone down, or tried to go down, the cliff, using that rope. Remember the noise we heard yesterday? It was the noise of the rope being pulled back. Since there was no way to get into the cave below from the front, someone found this way to reach it from the rear. But what sort of a rope could it have been? Lal Mohan Babu asked. I mean, if you had to climb down 100 feet, you would need a remarkably strong rope, wouldn't you? Yes, a nylon rope would do the trick. It would be light, but very, very strong. That means there was a second person here, I said slowly. I mean, apart from Mr. Bose. Right. The second person removed the rope and the crowbar. We don't yet know whether he was Bose's friend or foe, but there is something that indicates he might have been the latter. I looked quickly at Feluda. What did he mean? In reply, he took out a small object from his pocket and placed it on his palm. It was a piece of blue cloth, torn presumably from a shirt. Who was wearing a blue shirt yesterday? Mr. Jayant Malik. Where did you find it? I asked. My voice shook. Bose was lying on his stomach. His arms were spread wide. His right hand was closed around this piece of cloth, but a small bit was sticking out between two fingers. He and this other man must have struggled with each other by the cliff. Bose clutched at the shirt the other man was wearing, but then he fell, taking this little piece with him. You mean he was deliberately pushed off the cliff? Lal Mohan Babu gasped. You mean it was murder? Feluda did not give a direct answer. After a few seconds of silence, he simply said, If the statues in the temple are still intact, we must thank Mr. Bose for it. It was because of his presence here last night that the thief couldn't get away with it. Chapter 9. When we climbed down eventually and went back to the main entrance to the temple, the members of the film unit had all disappeared. There were knots of local people, curious and excited. The big American car had been replaced by a jeep. An intelligent and smart-looking man, possibly in his mid-30s, saw Feluda and came forward to greet him. It turned out to be Mr. Kulkarni, the manager of the tourist guest house. We realized only this morning that Mr. Bose had not returned last night, he said, shaking his head regretfully. I sent a bearer to look for him, but of course he couldn't find him anywhere. What is going to happen now? Feluda asked. The police in Aurangabad have been informed. They are sending a van to collect the body. Mr. Bose had a brother in Delhi. He'll have to be informed, naturally. It is really very sad. The man was a true scholar. He came once before, in 1968. I believe he was writing a book on Ellora. Isn't there a police station here? Yes, but it's only a small outpost. An assistant sub-inspector is in charge, a man called Gote. He is inspecting the body at the moment. Could I meet him? Certainly. Oh, by the way, Mr. Kulkarni stopped, looking doubtfully at Lalmohn Babu and me. They are friends. You may speak freely before them, Feluda said quickly. Oh, I see. Mr. Kulkarni sounded relieved. Well, someone rang Bombay this morning. Malik? Yes. What did he say? Mr. Kulkarni took out a piece of paper from his pocket and read from it. The daughter is fine. Leaving today. Today? Did he tell you anything about leaving today? He did. He wanted to leave this morning, but I thought of you, Mr. Mitter, and had a word with his driver. Malik has been told there is something wrong with his car. It'll take a while to repair it, so he cannot leave immediately. Bravo! Thank you, Mr. Kulkarni. You have been a great help. Mr. Kulkarni looked pleased. Feluda lit a charminar and asked, Tell me, what kind of a man is this Gote? A very good man, I should say, but he doesn't like it here. He longs for a promotion and a posting in Aurangabad. Come with me. I'll introduce you to him. Mr. Gote had emerged from the cave. Mr. Kulkarni brought him over and introduced Feluda as a very famous private detective. Mr. Gote's height was about 5 feet 5 inches. His width matched his height, and to top it all, he had a moustache like Charlie Chaplin. But his movements were surprisingly brisk and agile. Why don't you go back to the bungalow? Feluda said to me. I'll have a word with Mr. Gote and then join you there. Neither of us had the slightest wish to return without Feluda, but there was no point in arguing, so we went back. On reaching the bungalow, we realized we were both quite hungry, so I stopped to tell the chowkidar to send us toast and eggs. Then I walked into our room to find Lalmohn Babu sitting on his bed, looking a little foolish. Tell me, Tapesh, he said on seeing me, did we lock our room before going out this morning? Why, no. There was no need to. We had nothing worth stealing. Besides, the cleaners usually come in the morning, so I thought, why, has anything been taken? No, but someone has been through my things. Whoever did it sat on my bed and opened my suitcase. In fact, when I came in, the bed was still warm. See if he touched your suitcase as well. He had. I realized this the minute I opened the case. Nothing was in place. Not only that, one of my pillows was lying on the floor. Judging by the way my chappals had been thrown in 2 different directions, the intruder had even looked under the bed. I was most worried about my notebook, Lalmohn Babu confided. But he didn't take it, thank God. Did he take anything else? No, I don't think so. What about you? The same. Whoever came in was looking for something specific, I think. He didn't find it here. Let's ask the Chowkidar if he saw anything. But the Chowkidar could not help. He had gone out shopping for a while, so if anyone stole in while he was out, he couldn't have seen him. Normally, theft was a rare occurrence in these parts. The Chowkidar seemed most puzzled by the thought that anyone's room should be broken into and their belongings searched. Had Feluda's room been similarly ransacked? I went to have a look, but saw that his room was locked. He had to be extra careful because of his disguise. Should we try asking Rakshit? Lalmohn Babu asked. Having seen the flashing light in his room the night before, I was feeling rather curious about the man. So I agreed, and we both went up to his room. I knocked softly. The door opened almost at once. "What is it? Come in." Mr. Rakshit did not seem very pleased to see us, but we went into his room anyway. "Did anyone break into your room as well?" Lalmohn Babu asked as soon as he had stepped in. From the way Mr. Rakshit looked at Lalmohn Babu, it was obvious that he was not in a good mood. He spoke in a low voice, but his tone was sharp. "What's the use of speaking to you?" he said. "You can't hear a word, can you? Let me speak to your nephew. Not only did someone get into my room, but he actually removed something valuable." "What? What was it?" I asked timidly. "My raincoat. I had bought it in England, and had been using it for the last 25 years. Lalmohn Babu looked at me silently. He wasn't supposed to have heard anything. I repeated the words to him, speaking loudly, trying not to laugh. "Could it have been stolen last night?" Lalmohn Babu suggested. "We saw you looking for something. I mean, we saw your torch." "No. A small bat had somehow got into my room last night. I switched the main lights off and used my torch to get rid of it. Nothing was stolen yesterday. It happened this morning. I believe the culprit is that young boy of the Chowkidars." I had to shout once more and repeat the whole thing to Lalmohn Babu. "I'm very sorry to hear this," Lalmohn Babu said gravely. "We must keep an eye on the boy." There didn't seem to be anything else to say. We apologized for disturbing him and came away. The Chowkidar had served us breakfast in the dining hall. We began eating. I had no idea what American fried eggs tasted like, but what I had been given here was quite tasty. I kept wondering who might have broken into our room, but decided in the end that it must have been the Chowkidar's son. I had seen him walking in the backyard and throwing curious glances in the direction of our rooms. Feluda had told us to go back to the bungalow, but hadn't said that we had to stay in. So after breakfast, we locked our room and went out in the street. The guest house was not clearly visible from the main gate of our bungalow, the view being partially obstructed by a large tree. The sudden noise of a car starting made us go forward quickly. Now the guest house was fully visible. The taxi that had brought Mr. Rakshit and Lewison from Aurangabad was now ready to leave. The luggage rack on its roof was loaded. Mr. Sam Lewison, the American millionaire, was giving a tip to one of the bearers. But who was that? Another man had come out of the guest house and was speaking to Lewison. Lewison nodded twice, which clearly meant that he had agreed to do something for the other man. The latter went back to the guest house and reappeared with a suitcase. The driver opened the boot of the car and placed the suitcase in it. My heart began beating faster. Lalmohn Babu clutched my sleeve. There could be no doubt about the implication of what we had just seen. Mr. Jayant Malik was not going to wait for his own car to be repaired. He was trying to escape with Sam Lewison. The driver took his seat. "The cycle!" I cried. "The Chowkidar's cycle!" The car started. I ran back to the bungalow and managed to drag the cycle out. Luckily, no one saw me. "Come on," I said to Lal Mohan Babu. He stood there looking as though he had never ridden on the crossbar of a cycle before. But there was no time to argue. Our culprit was running away. He jumped up a second later, and I began pedaling as fast as I could. Feluda had taught me to cycle when I was 7. Now I could put it to good use. If we had walked, it would have taken us 20 minutes to get back to the temple. I covered that distance in 5. There was Feluda, and Kote, and Kulkarni. "Feluda!" I panted. "Mr. Malik went off, in that American's car, 5 minutes ago." Just that one remark from me set so many things in motion that the whole thing now seems almost like a blur. Mr. Kote jumped into his jeep, with Feluda beside him, and Lal Mohan Babu and myself at the back. I had no idea even a jeep could travel at 60 miles per hour. Very soon, we saw Lewison's taxi, overtook it, and made it stop. Lewison got out, looking furious and giving vent to his anger by uttering a range of specially chosen American swear words. These had no effect on Mr. Kote. He ignored Lewison completely and approached Malik, who turned visibly pale. Mr. Kote then opened his suitcase, quelling an abortive attempt by Malik to stop him, and took out an object wrapped heavily in a large Turkish towel. With one swift movement, he removed the towel and revealed the Yakshi's head. Sam Lewison shut up immediately, gaped in horror, and stammered, But I... Lal Mohan Babu heaved a sigh of relief and proclaimed, "Ends well, that all well." Finally, Lewison was allowed to travel back to Aurangabad. We returned to Khuldabad with the culprit, caught red-handed. Mr. Kote took Malik away to keep him somewhere in the police outpost. He went quietly, 2 days to say anything. We were dropped at the guest house, for Mr. Kulkarni was waiting anxiously for our return. He appeared very pleased on being told that our mission had been entirely successful. However, Feluda seemed to pour cold water over his enthusiasm by saying, "We haven't yet finished our job, Mr. Kulkarni. There's plenty more to be done. Don't forget to make inquiries about that number in Bombay, and let me know as soon as you hear anything." I didn't understand what this last instruction meant, but thought no more about it. Mr. Kulkarni had ordered coffee for all of us. When it arrived, I suddenly remembered we had not told Feluda about our own room being searched. He sipped his coffee quietly as I quickly explained what had happened. Then he frowned and asked Mr. Kulkarni, "What sort of a man is that Chowkidar?" "Who? Mohanlal? A very good man, most trustworthy. He has been doing this job for the last 17 years. I have never heard anyone complain against him." Feluda thought for a second, then turned to me. "Are you sure nothing was stolen?" "Yes, we are both absolutely sure. Mr. Rakshit thinks it was the Chowkidar's boy who did it." "Very well. Let's go and have a look, especially since Lal Mohan Babu says the intruder actually sat on his bed and kept it warm for him. See you soon, Mr. Kulkarni. Perhaps you had better keep this with you." He passed the Yakshi's head, still wrapped in the towel, to Mr. Kulkarni, who put it in a safe in his office and locked it. We returned to the bungalow. Feluda came into our room with us, bolted the door, and then went through our belongings with meticulous care. Apart from his clothes, Lalmon Babu's suitcase contained a small box of homeopathic pills, 2 books on criminology, 1 on Baluchistan, and his own notebook. For some reason, Feluda spent a long time going through his notebook, but did not tell us what was so intriguing about it. Finally, he put everything away and said, "If my guesses turn out to be correct, this whole business is going to be settled tonight, one way or the other. If that happens, you will both have to play an important role. Please remember at all times that I am with you, keeping an eye on you, even if you cannot see me. Don't tell anyone about Malik's arrest, and don't leave your room. In any case, I don't think you can, for it looks like it's going to rain." Feluda peered out of the window as he spoke, then got up silently and went and stood by it. I followed him. We were looking out of the western side. There was a lawn, across which stood a number of tall trees. I could recognize eucalyptus amongst them. A man came out of the trees, crossed the lawn, and went to the front of the bungalow. A moment later, he entered the dining hall. This was followed by the sound of a room being unlocked, and then locked again from inside. Feluda nodded and muttered, "Yes, yes," almost to himself. The man who had come in was Mr. Rakshit. "Wait until you hear from me," Feluda said, "and then simply do as you are told. Don't be afraid." He opened the door and went out. We remained in our room. Thunder rumbled outside. The sky was overcast. Staring at the walls, thinking things over, it suddenly occurred to me that the man who was probably the most mysterious was Mr. Rakshit. We did not know anything about him. And Malik? How much had we learnt about Giant Malik? Not much. Not enough. Suddenly, it seemed to me that we had made no progress at all. Chapter 10. It began pouring soon after 12 o'clock. The rain was accompanied by frequent thunder. Lalmohan Babu and I sat in our room trying, in vain, to work out what possible role we might have to play later in the day. Malik had been arrested. The Yakshi's head was safely locked away. As far as we were concerned, that was the end of the story. What else could Feluda be thinking of? The Chowkidar told us at 1 o'clock that lunch was ready. We went into the dining hall without Feluda. He was probably having lunch with Mr. Kulkarni in the guest house. Mr. Rakshit joined us. He had seemed extremely cross this morning when we had spoken to him, but now he appeared cheerful once more. "On a day like this," he said, "a Bengali ought to have khichdi, pakoras, and fried hilsa. I have lived out of Bengal for many years, but haven't forgotten Bengali habits." The meal we were served here was different, but no less tasty. I finished my bowl of dal and had just helped myself to the meat curry when a car drew up outside the front door and a thin, squeaky voice cried, "Chowkidar?" The Chowkidar rushed out, clutching an umbrella. Mr. Rakshit soaked a piece of his chapati in the curry, put it in his mouth, and said, "A tourist? In this weather?" A tall man walked in, taking off his raincoat. Most of his hair was grey. He had a short moustache and goatee, and he wore glasses. "I've already had my lunch," he told the Chowkidar, who was carrying his aged leather suitcase. Then he turned to us and asked, "Who has been arrested?" Feluda had told us not to say anything about Malik's arrest, so we simply stared foolishly. Mr. Rakshit gave a start and said, "Arrested?" "Yes, some vandal. He was apparently trying to steal a statue from one of the caves and was caught. At least, that's what I've just heard. I only hope they won't decide to close the caves because of this. I've travelled quite far simply to see the statues here. Why? Haven't you heard anything?" "No." "Anyway, I'm glad the fellow was caught. I must say the police here are quite efficient." The man was given the third empty room. He disappeared into it, but we could hear him talking to himself. Perhaps he was slightly mad. The rain stopped at around 2:30. Half an hour later, I saw the new arrival walking towards the eucalyptus trees. He came back in 5 minutes. The chowkidar brought us our tea at 4:30. I noticed a small piece of paper on the floor as he left. It turned out to be another message from Feluda. "Go to cave number 15 at 7 o'clock. Wait in the southeastern corner on the first floor." He was still running a campaign, totally unseen. This had never happened before. Fortunately, it did not rain again. When we left the bungalow at 6:30, both Mr. Rakshit and the man with the goatee appeared to be in their rooms, for their lights were on. Lalmohan Babu muttered a short prayer as we set out. My own feelings were so confused that I'm not even going to try to describe them. My hands felt cold. I thrust them into my pockets. We reached Kailash 10 minutes before 7. The western sky was still quite bright, since the sun did not set here at this time of the year until after 6:30. The caves and hills seemed darker, but the sky had cleared. We turned right after reaching Kailash. The next cave was number 15, the Das Avatar cave. It was at this one that Feluda had thrown a pebble last night. There was no one around. We walked on. The courtyard before the cave was large. There was a small shrine in the middle of it. We crossed it quickly and climbed a few steps to go through the main entrance that took us into the cave. We had been told to find the first floor. I could dimly see a flight of steps going up. God knew if there was anyone already hiding in the dark. We went up the steps, trying not to make any noise at all. The stairs led us to a huge hall. Rows of carved pillars stood supporting the roof, as though they were carrying it on their heads. There were scenes from Indian mythology, beautifully carved in the northern and the southern walls. We found the southeastern corner. It was too dark inside to see clearly. I had taken off my sandals before climbing the stairs, but now the rocky floor felt so cold that I had to put them on again. As neither of us knew how long we might have to wait, we sat down, leaning against the wall. Who knew what was going to happen next in this cave, built 1,200 years ago and filled with amazing specimens of ancient art? Something happened almost immediately. As soon as we had sat down, my eyes fell on something that made me give an involuntary gasp. Only a few feet away from where we were sitting, barely visible in the dark, was a solid round object lying on the floor. Sticking out from under it was a white square object. Neither was a part of the temple decorations. Someone had placed them there deliberately. What could they be? Who had kept them there, and for whom? Paper? Lalmohan Babu whispered, pointing at the white object. We rose and went closer. What we saw made us stare in utter disbelief. It was indeed a piece of paper, but what had been used as a paperweight was the Yakshi's head. There could be no mistake. We had seen it only this morning, first in Mr. Cota's hand, and then in Mr. Kulkarni's, who had locked it away in his safe. I shone the torch on the piece of paper. It was another message from Feluda, this time addressed to Lalmohan Babu. "Keep the head with you," it said. "If anyone demands it, hand it over to him." What could this mean? But there was no time to think. Lalmohan Babu said, "Jai Guru," and picked up the head. I put Feluda's message into my pocket, and we returned to our positions. Our eyes were now getting used to the dark. There appeared to be a faint moonlight outside. We could see a portion of the western sky through the pillars. It had turned a deep purple. Gradually, it changed its hue. Perhaps the moon had risen higher. It didn't seem as dark inside the cave as before. 8 o'clock, Lalmohan Babu muttered, letting go of a long sigh. Suddenly, a faint noise reached my ears. Someone was coming up the stairs, placing each foot with extreme caution. Then the noise stopped. A second later, the footsteps continued. The man was now walking on flat ground among the pillars. There! Now he was visible through a couple of pillars. He stopped and looked around. Then, with a click, he lit a lighter. The small flame went out almost as soon as it had appeared, but it was enough to illuminate his face. We recognized him instantly. Jayant Malik! How could he be here? He was supposed to be in police custody. My head began reeling. After this, I thought, if the dead Chubankar Bose turned up in person, I should not be surprised. Mr. Malik resumed walking, but did not come towards us. He made his way to the northeastern corner. That part of the hall was in total darkness. He disappeared from sight. My throat felt dry. I could hardly think clearly. Only one thing kept going round and round in my head. Where was Feluda? Where was Feluda? Where was Feluda? Lalmohan Babu had once declared he would give up writing crime stories because his real-life experiences were so much stranger. What would he say after today? The moonlight grew stronger as we waited. A dog barked somewhere in the distance. Then it was quiet once more. But not for long. A second man was climbing up the steps. Like Mr. Malik, he stopped for a moment on reaching the flat surface when the stairs ended. Then we could see him walking, but could not tell who he was. He did not stop to use a lighter. He was coming towards us, getting closer and closer, walking with slow, measured steps. Then, without the slightest warning, our eyes were dazzled by a powerful light. The man was shining a torch directly into our eyes. The footsteps came even closer, and a voice spoke, softly, but with biting sarcasm. "Dreaming of the moon, weren't you, you puny little dwarf? Who taught you to write threatening letters? Come to the Das Avatar cave at 8 p.m. Then you'll get back what you have lost, or else—" "Where did you learn all this, Professor?" "A professor of history, didn't you say? Can you hear me now, or are you still pretending to be deaf? How did you get involved in this, anyway? You had noted everything down in your notebook, hadn't you? I saw it myself. A Fokker friendship crashes. A Yakshi from Bhuvaneshwar gets stolen. The Kailash temple in Ellora. Even plain timings. Why have you got a child with you? Is he your bodyguard? Can you see what I've got in my hand right now?" I had recognized the voice as soon as it had started to speak. It was Mr. Rakshit. In his left hand was a torch, in his right was a pistol. I... Lalman Babu stammered. "Stop whimpering," Mr. Rakshit's voice boomed out. "Where's the real thing?" "Here it is. I kept it for you." Lalman Babu offered him the Yakshi's head. Mr. Rakshit took it with his left hand, making sure his right hand did not waver. "Not everyone can play this game. Do you understand?" He went on, still sounding furious. "It's not for the likes of you. You stupid little—" He broke off. A strange thing had started to happen. Great clouds of smoke were coming into the cave, spiraling up and slowly enveloping everything: the pillars, the carvings, the statues. As we stood gaping in absolute amazement at this thick sheet of haze, another voice rang out, almost like a bullet. It was Feluda. "Mr. Rakshit," he called, his voice as cold and hard as the stony floor we were standing on. "Not one, but 2 revolvers are pointing at you at this very moment. Put your gun down. Go on, throw it down." What's the meaning of this?" Mr. Rakshit cried, his voice suddenly uncertain. "Let me explain," Feluda replied. "We are here to punish you for your crime. And it isn't just one crime either. First, you destroyed and damaged a part of India's history. Second, you sold bits of your and our own heritage to foreigners. Third, you killed Shubhankar Bose." "No! Lies! These are all lies!" Mr. Rakshit shrieked. "Bose slipped and fell into the gorge. It was an accident." "If anyone is lying, it is you. The crowbar you had used has been found behind a cactus bush 50 yards from where Bose's body was found. It is heavily stained with blood. Had Mr. Bose slipped and fallen by accident, he would certainly have screamed for help. None of the guards here heard a scream. Besides, you had hidden a blue shirt among the plants behind the bungalow where we were all staying. A portion of the shirt is torn. I found it. The piece of blue fabric Bose was found clutching in the same—" Mr. Rakshit did not stop to hear any more. He leapt up and tried to dash out of the smoky curtain, only to find himself being embraced by 3 different men. To our right, Jayant Malik lit his torch. Now I could see Feluda, who had taken off his makeup. Next to him was Mr. Kote and a constable. At a nod from him, the constable put handcuffs on Mr. Rakshit. Feluda turned to Mr. Malik. "I must ask you to do something for me," he said. "See that other cave over there? You'll find Mr. Rakshit's raincoat in it, tucked away in the left-hand corner. Could you get it for me, please? Well, we mustn't stay in the smoke any longer. Come along, Topshe. Are you all right, Lalman Babu? This way, please." Feluda explained everything to us over dinner that night. We had dinner at the guest house. With us were Mr. Kulkarni, Mr. Kote, and Mr. Malik. "The first thing I should tell you," Feluda began, "is that Rakshit isn't his real name. His real name is Chaturaj. He is a member of a gang of criminals who operate from Delhi. Their main aim is to steal valuable statues, or even parts of statues, from old temples and sell them to foreign buyers, thereby filling their own pockets with tidy little sums. There must be many other gangs like this one, but at least we have managed to get hold of one. Chaturaj was made to come clean, and he gave us all the details we needed. It was he who had stolen that head, brought it to Calcutta, and sold it to Silverstein. Then, when he heard of the plane crash, he rushed to the spot, bought it back from that boy called Panu for just 10 rupees, and then chased Lewison all the way to Ellora. He wanted to kill 2 birds with 1 stone. The Yakshi's head could be sold to Lewison, and Chaturaj could steal another statue from Kailash. Sadly for him, he didn't manage to do either of these things. Lewison agreed to buy the stolen statue, but Chaturaj lost it before he could pass it on to Lewison. As a result, Lewison got very cross with him and left. He might have succeeded in removing a statue from Kailash, but 2 things stopped him. One was the sudden appearance of Shubhankar Bose. The other was a small pebble thrown on the courtyard before cave number 15. Feluda stopped for breath. I started feeling most confused. "What about Mr. Malik?" I blurted out. Feluda smiled. "The presence of Jayant Malik can be very easily explained. In fact, it was so simple that even I couldn't figure it out at first. Mr. Malik was simply following Chaturaj." "Why?" "For the same reason that I was chasing him. He wanted to retrieve the statue, like me. But that isn't all. He and I do the same job. Yes, he's a private detective, just like me." I cast a startled glance at Mr. Malik. He said nothing, but I saw that he was grinning, looking at Feluda and waiting for him to explain further. "When I made inquiries about him," Feluda went on, "I discovered that he worked for an agency in Bombay. They sent him to Calcutta recently in connection with a case. He stayed in a friend's flat in Queen's Mansion and used his car while the friend was away on holiday. Normally, the kind of cases these agencies handle are all ordinary and pretty insignificant. Mr. Malik was getting bored with his job. He wanted to do something exciting, much more worthwhile, and become famous. Is that right?" "Yes," Mr. Malik admitted. "I got the chance to work on such a case, most unexpectedly. My old job took me to the Grand Hotel last Thursday, and I happened to be in Nagarmal's shop when an American visitor showed that Yakshi's head to him. At that time, I paid no attention. All that I grasped was that the man was immensely wealthy, and his name was Silverstein. But when I heard about the plane crash the next morning, and they said he had been on that flight, it suddenly struck me that it might be possible to retrieve that statue. I have a little knowledge of ancient art, and I knew that what I had seen Silverstein carrying was extremely valuable. So I thought if I could get it back, it might be reported in the press, which would be a good thing for the agency as well. So I rang my boss in Bombay and told him what I wanted to do. He agreed and asked me to keep him posted. I left for Siddiqpur immediately, but it was too late. I missed Chaturaj by just 5 minutes. He got there first and brought the head back. There didn't seem to be anything I could do, but— "Do you remember the color of his car?" Feluda interrupted him. "Oh yes, it was a blue Fiat. I decided to follow Chaturaj, but I ran into some more problems. A burst tire meant an unnecessary delay, so I lost him for the moment. However, by then I was absolutely determined not to give up. I knew he would want to sell the statue again. So I went back to the Grand Hotel. It meant waiting for a while, but I eventually found him and followed him to the railway booking office. He bought a ticket to Aurangabad. So did I. He was still carrying a heavy bag, so it was clear that he had not been able to get rid of the statue. I came back to my flat, rang my office in Bombay, and told them what had happened. "Yes, we know about that. You had said, the daughter has returned to her father. What we did not know was that by father you meant Chaturaj, not yourself." Mr. Malik smiled, then continued. I kept waiting for a suitable opportunity to remove the stolen object. I knew if I could catch the thief at the same time, it would be even better. But that proved much too difficult. Anyway, last night I went and hid near Kailash. When I saw that everyone from the bungalow had gone out in the direction of the caves, I returned quickly, slipped into the bungalow through the side door that only the cleaners use, and removed the statue from Satyajit's room. I see. Did you have any idea you were being watched by a detective? Oh no. That's why I couldn't speak a word when you arrested me. I must have looked very foolish. Mr. Kotib burst out laughing. Feluda took up the tale. When I saw that you had travelled with Lewison in the same car for many miles, but had done nothing to sell him the statue, I realized you were innocent. Until then, although I had come to know you were a detective, I could not drop you from my list of suspects. But Satyajit was also on this list, wasn't he? Yes. Mind you, initially it was no more than a slight doubt. When I saw that his name had been freshly painted on an old suitcase, I began to wonder if the name wasn't fake. Then, Lalmohan Babu told us yesterday that he had gone out wearing a raincoat. When we were passing cave number 15, I noticed someone was in it, and threw a pebble in the courtyard. That made the man run away. I then went into the cave and began searching the surrounding area. In a smaller cave behind the big one, I found the raincoat. It had a specially large pocket, in which was a hammer, a chisel, and a nylon rope. I left everything there. It became obvious that Rakshit, or Satyajit, was the real culprit. As we returned to the bungalow, we saw him desperately searching for something in his room. In fact, he seemed to have gone mad, which is understandable since he had come back to his room to find that his precious statue had gone. This morning, Mr. Kulkarni told me you had called Bombay and said, "The daughter is fine." That meant you had the stolen statue with you, so you had to be arrested. Feluda stopped. No one said anything. After a short pause, he went on. While we were worrying about statues and thieves, Shubhankar Bose got killed. On examining his dead body, we found a piece of blue cloth in one of his hands. You were wearing a blue shirt yesterday, but I didn't think of you, since my suspicions had already fallen on Satyajit. What really happened was that he reached Bose's body before me, and pretending that he was trying to feel his pulse, pushed in that torn piece into the dead man's hand. It had become essential for Satyajit to throw suspicion on someone else for Bose's death. The torn piece had, of course, come from Satyajit's own shirt. He had cut out a piece and hidden the shirt amongst the plants and bushes behind the bungalow. I found it myself. However, although I had gathered some evidence against Satyajit, it was not enough to actually accuse him of murder and theft. As I was wondering what to do, Tapesh and Lalmohan Babu told me that someone had been through their belongings. This had to be Satyajit, for he had lost something valuable and was naturally looking for it everywhere. In Lalmohan Babu's suitcase was his notebook, which mentioned the theft of the statue from Bhubaneswar, Silverstein, and the plane crash. I knew at once that Satyajit had read every detail and was feeling threatened, thinking it was Lalmohan Babu who had stumbled on the truth. So I sent him a little note, pretending it had been written by Lalmohan Babu, asking Satyajit to meet him in the Das Avatar cave at 8 p.m. Before that, however, I told Satyajit that whoever had tried to steal a statue from Kailash the night before had been arrested. I knew this would set his mind at rest, and he would stop being on his guard. That man with the goatee! Lalmohan Babu and I cried together. Was that you? Yes, Feluda laughed. That was my disguise number 2. I felt I had to stay close to you, since we were dealing with a dangerous man. Anyway, he swallowed my bait at once. He thought a few sharp words from him would really make Lalmohun Babu return the head to him, and he could get away with it once again. Well, we all know what happened next. There is only one thing left for me to say. Mr. Malik and his agency will get full credit for their share in catching this gang. And I will pray for a promotion for Mr. Gote. I must also thank Mr. Kulkarni for the important role he played. But if a medal for courage and bravery could be given to anyone, it should go jointly to Tapesh Ranjan Mitter and Lalmohun Ganguly. Hear, hear, said Mr. Malik, and the others clapped enthusiastically. When the applause died down, Lalmohun Babu turned to Feluda and said a little hesitantly, "Does that mean this time my weapon didn't come into any use at all?" Feluda looked perfectly amazed. "Not come into use? What are you talking about? Where do you think all that smoke came from? It was no ordinary bomb, sir. Do you know what it was? A 356 megaton special military smoke bomb." The end.